Hey guys, welcome to another React. Today, we're reacting to a complete history of the British Isles by Overly Sarcastic Productions. I really like these guys. Oh, ignore that one. Spoilers, sweetie. Anyway, well, actually, full disclosure. This is I actually want to copy over this one, but since I have similar like headings, I got confused. Maybe I'll react to the other one later. If you want to see, well, you better freaking subscribe, huh? Subscribe, like the video, do all that stuff. Now, let's go. As per usual, I will link the videos in the description of every video I watch to pay respect. So, let's go. Let's watch.
Welcome to the British Isles, or maybe just the Isles. Well, Britain and Ireland? You know what, forget it. Welcome here, this Atlantic archipelago of one big island, a medium one, and several smaller islands kicking around the north coast of Europe. It's been known.
Any people who live in like the UK willing to weigh in on this? Because I'm not sure anyone who knows like what these islands are actually collectively called. I mean, I just call them the British Isles, but you know.
Known by many names to many people across the ages, and that's a microcosm of how I
Yeah. Free real estate. Yeah. Thanks for 11% of my genetic flavor, you guys. Full disclosure, my father's line lived right about up here. And my mother, well, comes from around here. In Ireland. Laconi. What's French for rival? Actually, no, we'll be more like brother or something.
like to interpret this history. These islands, whatever we choose to call them, are one gigantic exercise in how we understand point of view. Because history is more finicky than just facts about a thing, it's a story, a narrative told from the perspective of a character. That character could be a king, an artist, or something bigger, like a country, a culture, or a civilization. And just as characters in a play can perceive the same scene very differently, so too can players in history experience the same world and the same events in completely distinct ways.
God damn these two. I mean, he's probably gonna get into that. But like...
Now this is one of those facts of life that's always present, but we usually don't have to think about it too hard, because we can sit back in our comfortable third-person omniscient POV and understand the story just fine. The British Empire from the perspective of Britain is totally reasonable, but what about the British Empire?
Oh, God damn it. Do not talk to me about how... Okay, maybe not Britain, but like... England? I hope he talks about this, because this is really, 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 really fucked. I mean, that's probably, Oh, yeah, he does talk about it. Okay, so, I won't talk too much about it, but... Let's just say... I really hate how England basically screwed over the Articles of Union I think it's called the Act of Union. Because, I mean, you'll see later on in the video, but, this flag should be different. He'll explain, but it kind of pees me off that we didn't get that type of flag. Anyway.
From the perspective of Scotland, of Ireland specifically in the 1840s.
Oh yeah. I mean, without which my my ancestors wouldn't actually, leave Ireland. Thank you for the potato famine, England. You bastards.
Shift that POV ever so slightly and the story can come out radically.
This is why I love this fucking channel, just these, like, asides. Britain, this is perfect, no notes. But actually, that shouldn't be, that should be England. That shouldn't be, I suppose, yeah, it should be England, but yeah, this is perfect, no notes. Ireland, not perfect, several notes. And Scotland is just like, Rrr. Wales, I am also here. Please notice me. Shut up, sheeples.
Different. Again, this happens everywhere, but I think this phenomenon and the intricacies of perspective are best understood by unpacking this gaggle of islands right here. So, as we embark on a 2,000-year history of England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and Britain, I want to give each player their due and tell the story from each of their perspectives.
Isle of Man slandered once again by exclusion. Yeah, technically speaking, they are their own culture. They even have their own language, apparently. It's like related somehow to like the Irish's like Gaelic tongue, kind of ish.
That will let us understand them.
Wait, hang on. Is it Irish or wait? No, scratch that. It's not related to Gaelic. It's related to yeah, there's two separate things. There's two separate language groups. There's Brythonic and the other one. Oh wait, no. Oh, fuck. The stuff that Irish speaks is not even called Gaelic. It's Irish. They changed that because they were sick of people lumping it in with like Scotland. Or one of the other people said that. So, yeah. Yeah. I apologize.
On their own terms, as well as highlight...
Wait, does he talk about this? Talk about the linguistic stuff? Yes, English linguistics. Good.
How they interact as a system. However, that means I can't just run it front to back chronologically. So rather than spend 2 millennia jumping back and forth across 4 parallel tracks, confusing ourselves to no end, we're going to play each country's story in sequence, then tie it all together when they converge into one metric British Empire. But we have to begin somewhere, so let's start the clock in the 1st century BC, set our sights on England, and do some history. Names are hard, especially when it comes to the British Isles. The island of Britain is home to England, Scotland, and Wales, while the island of Ireland is composed of the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom's Northern Ireland. This is not only a nightmare to keep track of, but as we've seen, this is all subject to change, probably a little sooner than we think. I say all this to clarify what we're actually going to be
What did that say?
Subject to change, probably a little sooner.
Alien go bra. Alba go breath. I assume those words mean something.
Sooner than we think. I say all this to clarify what we're actually going to be talking about in this video. England. Now, not only is England not Britain, but its history is plenty interesting all its own.
Hang on.
Now, not only is England not
That's 1603. I thought the Acts of Union was 1707. What? Maybe the prototypes of the flag go back 100 years. Maybe. I don't know.
Britain, but its history is plenty interesting all its own. So, to see how England grew from a simple Roman province to the master of Britain and a major world power, let's do some history. Our
That's right.
earliest documentation for England comes with the arrival of Julius Cheekbones Caesar, who crossed over from Gaul in 55 BC. The native
Well, tried. As evidenced. You tried once. Didn't get it.
Celts were none too pleased with their new neighbors, so Rome kind of stalled for a century until Emperor Claudius established the province of Britannia. Roman influence on the island was rather slim outside of the main port cities. Since it was hard enough to schlep all those armies across the channel, they were happy to delegate certain responsibilities to the local kings.
Yeah. Basically paid off a few, local Brythonic tribes. Let me see if I can remember these. Nonia? Is that one?
In 60 AD, one such client king bequeathed half of his lands to Rome, but when the empire glommed all of it anyway, the late king's wife Boudica led a rebellion that burned through several eastern cities, including Londinium, before
I thought Boudica was part of Wales. Was from Wales. What? She was from East Anglia. Huh.
she was defeated in battle. Later, Romans expanded outwards
Sag. Very sad.
to the edge of Caledonia before Hadrian said no
What if Britannia were there?
and built a wall across the island to stop any hotshot general from getting ideas.
Wait, what? I talked over that part, I'm sorry.
Before she was defeated in battle. Later, Romans expanded outwards to the edge of Caledonia before Hadrian said nope and built a wall across the island to stop any hotshot general from getting ideas.
Wait, so it was Rome who stopped. It wasn't... I thought it was, because they tried to and couldn't.
The benefit of Britannia's insulation was that it didn't see much disruption from the carousel of imperial civil wars, but the downside was that Britannia was the first province to be cut loose when the barbarians started rolling up in the 400s.
Yeah, they kind of... Well, they didn't screw them over. I think they let them go in, like, yeah, during the... Yeah, it was the crisis of the 3rd century. Basically, a whole crap... It was like... yeah, but there was a lot of, like, plagues, coupled with a couple of... of really crap emperors. Like 3 or 4, if I remember rightly. Plus, I think it was the Sassanids. They were encroaching on their territory. I think it was the Sassanids. Assyrians? One of those.
The next several centuries are marked by a constant shuffling between small Romano-Britannic kingdoms and a tidal wave of Northern European newcomers. The polite term for this is disorganized, and the accurate term for this is gross. The early medieval period saw raids and migrations from Picts, Angles, Jutes, and Saxons, and while the map doesn't stop fidgeting with
People always forget about the Jutes. They always rely on the Anglos and the Angles and the Saxons, but they always forget about the Jutes. The Jutes are also there. Justice for the Jutes. Or Utes. However you say it. It's probably Utes.
its borders anytime soon, the players get a little clearer by the late 600s. Here we can see 7 major Anglisk and Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, Kent, East Anglia, Mercia, Essex, Sussex, and
Not that mercy.
Wessex. Those last 3 being East, South, and West Saxony.
They were really creative naming their kingdoms. East Saxony, South Saxony, West Saxony, Essex, Sussex, Wessex. You guys are super creative. Good job.
In case you were wondering why England sexed up so many of its place names. These kingdoms weren't entirely Britannic nor fully Germanic.
And by the way, they weren't spelled like that. They were, Essex. There was like a silent E at the end of the sex. Pretty sure.
Just like the Romans, it was a case of gradual integration between lots of small and unique groups of people, sometimes friendly, sometimes stabby. For a dash of literary context, the legendary character of King Arthur is set specifically against the backdrop of these Germanic migrations. Historically speaking, our record gets a little clearer in the Christian.
Oh my god, that's where I got confused with Wales. It was King Arthur! Ah! Yeah! Yeah, King Arthur was theorized to be a descendant of Roman nobility, technically. Which actually reminds me, I want to do a Crusader Kings 3 playthrough where trying, reconquer the Roman Empire as one of the Counts of Wales. Because it is theorized that the guys who actually formed Wales, the Principality of Wales, I can't remember who they are. Yeah, one of them. It was theorized, well, he said he was descendant from Roman nobility as well. So, yeah. That's the thing.
Monasteries of Northumbria, where the scholar Bede wrote the Ecclesiastical History of England, our best source for this period. And monasteries all across Northumbria were becoming magnificent palaces of literature and art throughout the 600s and 700s. Northumbria can have a little bit of a golden age, as a treat. The good news is that this was really shiny, but the bad news is that maybe this was a little bit too shiny, as the glittering attracted our old pals the Vikings, who rolled up to the island monastery of Lindisfarne to save the priceless relics from the totally unrelated fires that started burning right as the Vikings arrived.
Yeah, totally unrelated. Also, they totally didn't scope the monks who were there. Definitely not. Nope. It's Saxon propaganda. Or Anglo propaganda, at least. Also, I wonder which one of these guys is my ancestor.
Weird. From there, the Vikings kept on coming, raiding all up and down the coasts and even heading inland with the Great Heathen Army. This was
Yeah, that's crazy, I actually learned. They didn't only raid England, which is where people mostly, associated with. They raided as far inland in Europe as, Kiev, the Roman Empire, or Byzantines at this time. Even Africa, apparently. In fact, these guys will probably come up, a little bit later. But apparently the Normans are a remnant of Viking conquest into France. I've been playing Crusader Kings 3 for how many hours? 500 hours? And I just learned that now. I mean, not now, but recently. What the heck?
was especially bad news for the King of Wessex, who was partway through conquering Mercia when the Scandinavians glomped their way down the eastern coast. They didn't have the means or the interest.
Okay, I didn't know that. Okay. I didn't know they conquered all the way down here. I thought they stopped around here, around East Anglia. Dude.
To form a single unified state, but the laws of these incoming Danes held sway over a pretty beefy stretch of land. So we call this thingy the Dane Law because when historians aren't creative, they're at least direct. While the Dane Law became a shiny mercantile midpoint between Ireland and Scandinavia, it was soon reverso-glomped by the Kingdom of Wessex. By 927, King Ethelstan had conquered all the way to Northumbria and began to style himself as King of England. So,
AKA King Alfred. Athelstan Alfred.
Now, finally, we can actually discuss England as a single state. In the century following, Northumbria played hopscotch between English and Viking rule, and some wacky royal gymnastics resulted in the Scandinavian Canute becoming king of England, Denmark, and Norway for 2 decades. But despite the near constant
Yeah, it wasn't very long empire. 20 years.
higher fire of Scandinavian invasions and an extremely squiggly royal lineage, England had become impressively well run for the time, as the governing bureaucracy was organized and they knew how taxes worked. Not bad. But
Well, only kind of.
as will become a running theme in the next few centuries, there's no getting over that pesky question of royal succession. After the death of King Edward in 1066, the crown passed to Harold Godwinson, but 2 other parties wanted that shiny headwear for themselves, namely King Harold Hardrada of Norway and Duke William of Normandy. Hardrada arrived to challenge Godwinson for the title of one true herald, but was beaten at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. However, Godwinson's luck ran out 1 month later when... And that's the Norman conquest in a nutshell. In contrast to the other assorted cases of England being conquered, this one had lasting significance. Firstly, William was set on keeping his hot new kingdom, so he invented this little doohickey called a castle and built them all over England to protect his armies from the odd revolt.
Also, he's probably going to talk about this, but there was this little thing called the Harrying of the North, in which there was like a little bit like fomentings of a rebellion up north in York. And so what did William do? He literally scoured that shit. He literally, I want to say, nuked the entire place to the point where it's still recovering today. What the hell?
Meanwhile, he replaced the English aristocracy with freshly imported Norman barons. Now, the Normans, being from France, were French, so they spoke their native language instead of the local Old English. Over the centuries, these 2 languages switched into each other to create what we recognize as English, our beautiful...
Yeah. I'm gonna have to do like a react about this. This is like one of my pet peeves. Even though technically France is another slice of Germanic, I really want to have English be, you know, more true to its Germanic roots. There's a cool video that I should probably react to about this subject. It's freaking wild. Comment if you want to see that.
Disaster of a language. The last significant consequence was that William was still Duke of Normandy, and his supervisor, the King of France, was a little miffed that he went and yoinked himself a kingdom.
Yeah.
And this diplomatic hiccup would embroil England and France in a casual 600-year-long rivalry. Now, this is normally the point where English history slavishly trails along the royal family tree through all its twists and turns, but this video is a summary, and I don't care about kings. Royal gymnastics are far too dull to be this needlessly confusing. I say this now so we can skip the faff later on. What matters
England started using St. George's Cross in the 1190s, becoming the official flag centuries later. But life is easy if we take consistent iconography where we can get it. Yeah, it's not technically accurate because, you know, technically they were using the, you know, the 3 lions, whatever, but yeah. Oh shit, I forgot what I originally paused for. Crap.
to us here in the mid 1100s is that the royal family married across the Channel, so now the King of England became the Duke of Normandy, the Count of Anjou, and the Duke of Aquitaine. England has never been taller. This Angevin period rewrites Anglo-Frankish relations to the tune of "you got chocolate in my peanut butter." Anywho, with this absurdly large tax base and access to half of France load of natural resources up and down the Atlantic coast,
I understood that reference. I should react to that on my on this channel. Comment below if you get the reference.
the Angevin Empire was an economic powerhouse. Of course, money means rich people, and rich people means armed robberies, so this period is the main
Oh yeah, I forgot that Robin Hood was technically a real dude. Ish. I forget that.
historical setting for the legends of Robin Hood, most closely associated with the reign of the crusading King Richard the Lionhearted at the turn of the 13th century. Speaking of military stuff, England took this opportunity to hop westward and glomp onto the Dublin-y part of Ireland. They
Conquest of Ireland. Yeah. 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 I like to call it as their first taste of colonization.
tried for more, but they didn't really get much else. Conquest is all well and good, but it's also expensive, and France was itching to get the rest of its France back, so the early 1200s saw Normandy, Anjou, and most of
France to the refrancing. What are these names, man?
Aquitaine go poof. Meanwhile, the barons were fed up with the monarchy, that makes two of us, so they forced a few kings to sign a contract recognizing that teamwork makes
That makes three of us.
the dream work. As in, the Magna Carta makes kings consult their barons, and this puts us on track to get Parliament a ways down.
Holy shit, that is a wall of text. Okay, I feel intimidated.
The line. Elsewhere in Britain, King Edward Longshanks conquered the Kingdom of Wales and glomped onto Scotland for a hot second, but they broke free. The problem for England was that Scotland had allied with France, and by the mid-1300s, France was in a century-long win streak. King Edward III was a big fan of the part where England owned half of France, so he went for broke and claimed a right to the French kingship to justify a continental invasion. A bold strategy. It won't work, but it took a century for that to become apparent. From 1337 to 1453, England and France were locked in a 100 Years' War. Edward oversaw the first act.
Yeah, 100 Years War, not technically 100 years. It's like 120-ish.
Where the English poured across the Channel and thrashed the French army at the Battle of Crécy. To explain why, we've got to dig into the real juicy stuff. Economics. Alright, look, I minored in econ. I have to at least pretend like this was worth something, okay? It all comes down to how they collected taxes. England had the sophistication to tax money and put it towards a professional army, while France took payment in goods and conscription, so their army was bigger, sure, but far weaker.
England can raise significant revenues by taxing incoming merchant ships at ports. These revenues paid for Welsh longbowmen, and the rest is GG.
Payment in goods and conscription, so their army was bigger, sure.
France had a system called scutage, which allows a lord to call his subjects to arms for a period of 40 days.
But far weaker. England's advance would have pressed on were it not for the surprise guest appearance of plague. Soon after the fighting resumed, the new French king, Charles V, had a much better time than his predecessor and pushed the English out to the edges of Gascony and Calais. The third phase of the war is the spicy stuff that shows up in all those Shakespeare plays. We're talking Battle of Agincourt, Henry V, hella longbows, take that, Frenchies! After the
Henry V? Henry V? Henry V. Thank you very much.
loss, France fell into a civil war and almost collapsed until Joan Kick-Ass d'Arc arrived.
Love this bitch! Yes! She was my favorite, historical figure growing up. I love this chick! Quite frankly, it was actually one of my, fun fact, it was actually one of my, foundations actually questioning my Christian, because I went to a Christian secondary school. Yeah. It's just like one of the first things that I learned about that was just like, wait. Religion is kinda shit. I mean, I don't mind anyone who like worships this kind of thing. I mean, you do you, but like, they burned someone at the stake just because she was a woman. And also she believed in the wrong type of god. Yeah. historically not cool. Not cool.
To absolutely steamroll the English. King Henry VI had exactly 0 ways to handle this, so England got swept right on out of there. By 1453, all they had left was a tiny little sliver of Calais. Despite the war's overt goal of conquer France, it inadvertently cemented a distinct English identity through language, national heroes, and insular geography. The other major consequence was
It's weird, that's exactly what happened to us. With the Anzacs, actually, in World War One. In World War One, that was actually the English remarked that it was like the first time that they actually saw that there were differences between how the Australians talked and how they talked. It was kind of like the foundation of like our own national identity and how, ballsy we were. Speaking of, another react target we need to do. The second battle thermophile, which I recently realized that exists. And we, the Anzacs, actually fought in it. Regrettably, it was also a bit of a failure as well, but at least we didn't get betrayed like the Spartans did. Anyway, that's spoilers. Anyway, whatever.
Big shock, another succession crisis.
Yay.
I've covered the War of the Roses before and— Hi, pardon the interruption, but let me stop myself there. 720p Blue is right that I did cover it in an experimental spin-off, but the audio is completely scuffed, so in the interest of thoroughness, allow me to overdub myself as I splice in this interlude. The War of the Roses is what happens when you let George R. R. Martin write real-world history. Our story begins with England and France already 100 years deep in a clash.
Yes, he definitely didn't use War of the Roses as inspiration for, the first arc of Game of Thrones. Definitely didn't. Nope.
Classic medieval slap fight, England's king decides to make everything worse by bypassing his still very much alive sons to make his grandson king instead. Henry IV of House Lancaster calls BS and takes the throne in 1399, much to the annoyance of House York. Then, a couple Henrys later, King Henry VI blows England's lead and loses the 100 Years' War, so the Yorkies sweep in to take the reins as Lords Protectors. The Lancasters aren't thrilled about this power grab, so they kick the Yorkies out of court and then proceed to get trashed by them at the Battle of St. Albans in 1455. This changes the game from convoluted backroom palace drama to full-on Civil War mode. Advisors switch sides, nobles and royals drop in and out of exile like it's a semester abroad, and battles erupt all across the English countryside. Several stabbings later, the now clinically insane Henry VI works out a compromise deal for peace with the Yorks and a formalized royal succession, but all of
Several stabbings later. Ah, yes. Okay.
that goes out the window when the Yorks decisively kick their asses in 1471 and take the crown for keeps. This unfortunately goes south when the York King Edward dies, because it turns out all his kids are illegitimate due to his chronic condition of having a secret wife, so the kids get locked in
Yeah, that definitely would put a damper on things.
jail and mysteriously disappear forever. Convenient. Another York crowns himself king, but a Lancaster rolls into England with a French army to swipe
I'm already confused, by the way. I hope you guys can follow this, because I'm kind of not.
the crown and declare himself King Henry VII. Then ends the War of the Roses for good by marrying a York, uniting their families under the new royal house of Tudor. After over a century of crown shuffling, 3 decades of open war, a dozen
Hang on. Hang the flip on. Wait, was it? Wait. Oh no, I'm getting confused. For some reason, I thought Tudor was also Windsor. Never mind.
major battles and a much more satisfying ending than Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Man, that burn had a lot more zest in 2019. Such is the peril of referential humor. But let's not dally, back to our regularly scheduled England. All that matters is that a king died and 2 families spent a century stabbing each other over who would get the crown. Plot twist, both of them. Big ups to Henry VII for marrying the houses of York and Lancaster together to create the Tudor dynasty and resolve that mess for good. The Tudors managed to accomplish quite a bit in their century-long runtime. The first order of business for King Henry VIII was to formalize the rules for royal succession, presumably because he had to read about the War of the Roses and decided never again. But
Yeah, that shit's too complicated. Wait. Is Henry VIII the one who decided to go on a murder spree because he couldn't have a son? Am I remembering that right?
He also had outside problems, as King Charles of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, coincidentally the same Charlie, was getting a smidge overpowered since he put the
Oh,
Pope
God.
under house arrest. Further complicating matters was the little fact that Henry's first wife was also Charles's aunt, and she wasn't bearing any male heirs. Henry deftly
Oh,
solved
yeah, it
the
was
three
the right
problems
guy.
of Charles, the Pope, and his wife in one move by going diet Protestant and forming his own church. This new Church of England didn't really lean that hard into Protestant theology, but the real swerve was that the church
So starts Anglicanism, Anglicism, the Anglican Church. Yes.
answered only to the king. This quasi-reformist compromise
I do love how this is basically what happens in like most Crusader Kings 3 games. It would just be like, you know what? What if I have my own sect of insert religion? But I'm the head of faith.
wasn't exactly the easiest thing in the world.
Catholics believe that breaking with Rome was far too radical, while hardcore reformists thought Henry didn't go far enough. There's always extremists in like every school of thought, right?
To enforce, but the Tudors made it work. Meanwhile, back in geopolitics land, Henry made a new push into Ireland and tried and failed to bully Scotland into uniting with England. In the
Yeah, you see the theme? Fucking stop! That was my impression of a Scot accent. I hope my Scottish viewers forgive me.
second half of the century, Queen Elizabeth I held the fort against an increasingly aggressive Spain, way too hyped on conquistador cash to remember what hubris means. In 1588, Spain hucked an armada at England in the hopes of conquering it, but English cannons and English weather smashed the fleet to bits. When Elizabeth died
Was this a sign of like English domination of the waves, or was that a little bit later? I can't remember.
without an heir, the crown passed to her nearest male relative, who happens to be
It probably was, actually. I talked over that bit. I'm gonna make sure to pause.
bits. When Elizabeth died without an heir, the crown passed to her nearest male relative, who happens to be King James VI of Scotland. So in 1603, James became King of Scotland.
Yes, see? He does acknowledge it. This is the original flag. It's got the Scottish, the St. Andrew's cross first, then the cross of St. George. It looks so much better than the one we have. But no, England had to be a bitch and put its flag on the top. This is a much better flag. The England screwed over it, screwed over the Scots, and I hate it. This is a much better flag. Say in the comments, it's a much better flag. I dare you to say something different.
And England. Everything after the Union of the Crowns is the Britain plotline, where they glomp all the Isles, make an empire, all that Rule Britannia jazz. So this is where we'll wrap our history of England. At a glance, it's a 1600-year-long nightmare that stuff.
Well, actually, it's not. It's more like, yay for Britain, boo for everyone else. Literally everyone else. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't England like the cause of like the majority of like Independence Days? And there's like only 3 countries that were never conquered by an external power. It's like Thailand, Nepal, and one other one. Colonialism, just Jesus.
with more monarchs than anybody should be forced to remember, and it's easy to get bogged down in any one episode or to lose track entirely. But the good news is that if we zoom out a little bit and focus on England as a unit rather than a backdrop for royal gymnastics, the important kings will make sense in context and we avoid getting bogged down in the details. So then we can clearly see the macro plot progression from Roman province through the Heptarchy into the conflicts with France and out towards the formation of Britain. So let English history show why the big picture is often the clearest, and also serve as an object lesson in the historiographic benefits of restraint. Thank you, old-timey Blue. Now, when looking at the story of the Isles, the English perspective tends to be the one we default to, since it ended up so thoroughly in the driver's seat, it's tempting to consider it at least subconsciously as the most essential.
Westminster is Bestminster. I hate that. I hate that. Also, it kind of annoys me that this guy basically blew over the plot of, like, do you know at one point that England was ruled over by a republic? Apparently that happened.
One. That, of course, is a touch reductive, but it does make England a great anchor point as we begin to play with perspective. We're going to stick with the old red and white a little while longer, but zoom in on the English Renaissance, looking at the lives of its most famous king and its most famous bard. When presenting history in a public setting, there's a delicate line between putting famous figures on blast for the irresponsible, immoral, or just downright memeable, and falling into the trap of rewarding bad behavior with attention. In this
I felt like the internet could, like, use a little bit of a lesson with this. Like, just because a person did bad things that are immoral today doesn't mean you should freaking ignore that and just say they're all bad. A lot of people are saying, you know, claiming these things, but it's just stupid.
regard, researching a notorious king becomes much like watching over a toddler. No hitting! Hands to yourself, please! Do not put that in your mouth! Negotiating for basic manners with a baby is hopeless, and so is expecting any better from a monarch, because they're both playing by a completely different rule set, and you can see it in their eyes that they know it too. And this is why I spend so
Okay, using
set, and you can see
I can't remember if this is supposed to be Rasputin or Vlad the Impaler. But both were pretty fucked up. I acknowledge that. Yes.
it in their eyes that they know it too. And this is why
Crazy
I spent so
fucker.
few videos recounting the lives of big boy kings and their Tonka truck wars. It's just exhausting, and I always feel like I'm rewarding that bad behavior. But today, in the spirit of the Valentine's season, I'm going to talk about love. Or rather, whatever the hell Henry VIII was doing. There is some overlap, but boy is it slight. So, to learn the story of England's most notorious lady killer as an object lesson in what never to do, let's do some history.
Okay. I think I know where he's going with this. Plus, he literally made an entire new church for, I know, because of his wife. Cons, well, count them, there were about 6. Yes.
We begin in England in the 1500s as young Prince Hal was an extremely captivating figure, admired in his day for his athleticism, charm, and good looks. Sure,
Okay.
he's at once better and worse than we're liable to give him credit for. A multilingual and multi-talented king, he was an artistic patron and participant in the Renaissance tradition. He was also full of a royally insatiable appetite for food and women alike. Those traits were only matched by his impulsiveness, arrogance, and self-obsession. He got bored.
I was about to say, like, about insatiable and impulsive, and just like, oh shit, that sucks. Sounds like me. And then just like, reckless, cruel, implacable, duplicitous, and in general, sus. I agree with the sus, but all the rest, maybe not.
Easily and was as distrustful as he was covetous. Henry's paranoia led to the death of queens, officials, religious dissenters, and nearly every advisor who ever served him. Yet, for the first 2 decades of his reign, he was popular in his court and among the subjects, in large part because he played the royal jock while his father's advisors and one notoriously corrupt Cardinal Wolsey ran the kingdom. But even early on, he couldn't leave well enough alone. Bored of being merely a celebrity, Henry wanted to get the blood rushing by winning glory. So, as ever, the clearest option was in France. Yet, as ever, it did not work, costing the entire treasury in one go and only proving that poor tiny England absolutely could not compete with the great powers of Europe. So, with great frustration, he turned his focus back to England. And this would prove especially bad news for his wife, Catherine of Aragon, as it's here where Henry's reign surpasses the generically inept and descends into the true hallmark of his career, religion-shattering horniness. Now, before we progress, it is my historian's responsibility to remind you that people are complicated and memes are not. So we're on the receiving end of a 500-year gossip circle that we ourselves perpetuate every time we laugh at old King Sixwives instead of thinking through what the history meant for the actual human people who lived it. Henry certainly belongs in horny jail, but we can't pat ourselves on the back if we reduce an extremely consequential chapter of English history to the joke answer. So let's consider, what did Henry want? In a word, a son. Henry grew up in the wake of the War of the Roses and was acutely aware of how catastrophic the line of succession would get without a clear male heir. His Tudor dynasty was new and it was not guaranteed to stay in power. Henry was married to the stately Queen Catherine of Aragon, but after 2 decades of marriage, no son. Lots of infant mortality and one daughter Mary who survived to adulthood, but Henry figured that would
Holy shit.
son. Lots of infant mortality and one daughter Mary who
That is a very severe looking face. Wow.
survived to adulthood, but Henry figured that wouldn't cut it in a fiercely patriarchal society like medieval Europe. Catherine had been a good queen and a good wife, but once she was past childbearing years, Henry had no use for her. He had plenty of mistresses, but
I'm sorry, but this is... I love how he's trying to put, like, the human spin on it, but... Henry VIII is basically anyone who's played Crusader Kings 3. Oh shit, you're out of childbearing age? Oh no! She conveniently fell down a cliff! Oh no! Anyway, yoink, young new wife. It's hard not to conflate that into a meme, you gotta admit. Like, come on.
illegitimate sons would do him no good either. What he needed was a brand new wife. And people had done this before. Divorce, per se, was not recognized by the church, but you could...
Yeah, it's... you could technically swing it? By, like, just something infidelity, something consanguinity, something blah blah blah. Both of Henry's sisters had the marriages annulled. Mary Tudor was betrothed to Emperor Charles V, but the Pope broke the contract. Margaret Tudor divorced in 1527 and remarried later that year.
Get an annulment where the Pope says, oh, that marriage? Yeah, that never happened. You've actually been single the whole time. In fact, Catherine was first married to Henry's brother, but after he died, the marriage was annulled so she could marry Henry. But this time, the Pope was unmovable. Diplomacy, bargaining, saying pretty please, Rome would not budge. In Europe, Henry was...
Well, to be honest, it kind of makes sense considering that, you know, who he was married to is her brother kind of owned Central Europe as well as the Pope themselves. So, understandable saying, screw you, I'm gonna make my own church. With me as the head. Because I'm a legend.
Powerless. But in England, he was the one in charge. In 1532, a decade and a half after Martin Luther woke up and chose mayhem, Henry...
Oh, yeah. Good old Martin Luther. Pope sucks. Here's 144 reasons why.
Broke with Rome and declared that the church in England was answerable only to the king. Some of Henry's advisors objected, so naturally Henry had them killed, and some Catholics in the north rebelled, so naturally Henry had them crushed as well. Everyone else carried on with their day for fear of the harsh new anti-treason laws.
I'm pretty sure this was the side of Anglicanism, because... What? Anglicanism? Because... Or was this just Protestantism?
And with that, Henry had his church, his annulment, and his new wife, Anne Boleyn. She had been a court lady to Catherine, and when Henry started making kissy faces at her, she refused to be a mistress and insisted he marry her properly before any slamming was to begin. Honestly, well played. A few very short months after their marriage, Anne gave birth to the future Queen Elizabeth, but that was it. Uh-oh. In the midst of all that, Henry was struggling to reconfigure his monarchy now that he was the head of the Church of England. He became responsible for giving alms to the poor and happily confiscated...
Henry confiscated his way into only 15% of English land, but later had to sell it all the way to the nobility because he blew the treasury on another war. Hashtag just king things. To be honest, that's actually a thing that the crown actually does have today. Apparently, the crown can actually take and like confiscate all the land in England if it so chooses. Apparently, that's a thing. I have no idea if it's real because I technically got it from a movie called Johnny English. So, not actually sure it's a thing, but it sounds true.
All of the old church lands. However, he had neither the time nor patience for another sonless wife. Blissfully unaware of how chromosomal genetics actually works, he concluded that this marriage was also cursed and had her annulled, and executed for adultery and treason. Zoinks. This kind of...
Executed for adultery. Adultery and treason is crazy. You went against the king and crown because you didn't get me a son. You absolute bitch.
kind of frivolous cruelty also undermines the entire hoist of doing Protestantism in the first place, which frankly is typical Henry.
Oh, so it was Protestantism. Wait, when did the Anglican Church first form then? That's a thing.
Henry's subsequent betrothal to Jane Seymour the next day would finally net him the son he
Wait, literally the next day. Dude.
always wanted. Never mind what Edward VI was like as king, because he'd be succeeded 7 years later by Mary and Elizabeth anyway, so this whole exhausting ordeal is the result of one man's paranoia, lust, and enthusiasm for beheadings. But with the mission finally complete, do you know what happens to Jane Seymour? She died of an infection 2 weeks later. I don't know whether to be sad for her awful luck or relieved that she didn't live to see what it's like when Henry got a whiff of someone else's perfume.
Rip Jane Seymour, you gave Henry the male heir he always wanted, and then courteously spared Henry the cost of the annulment papers and the executioner's hourly fee. His Highness the King is most grateful for your supreme efficiency.
But with his beloved bloodline preserved, Henry turned back to foreign policy and failed just as badly as he did when he was a teenager. He wanted a German Protestant wife as a check against Emperor Charles V and chose Anne of Cleves in 1540, a mail-order bride he picked from a portrait gallery. But
wait, I thought that was just a meme in Crusader Kings 3. to like riff off of Tinder. That actually happened in real life? Okay. Fuck. Wow. Wow.
Henry McSleeps around suddenly got all choosy and annulled the marriage the same year because Anne didn't look enough like her portrait. Rude.
Okay, I understand these were real people, but that is so fucking funny. He claimed he got ripped off because he didn't look like enough like her portrait. Oh my. Holy shit, they're just like me, for real, for real. Times really haven't changed. What the hell?
That said, this ended a lot better than it very easily could have, so let's take the win and move on.
And spent the next 17 years living up in 2 palaces with all the privileges of a royal family member, but with absolutely none of the responsibilities or implicit marital dangers associated with being queen. Anne of Cleves was a full-on boss. Good for her.
He next married Catherine Howard. There was a religious strategy to this. I don't care, and he eventually had her executed for adultery as well.
There was a religious thing here, but I can't be bothered to recount it, so he just murdered her for adultery. I don't care.
Restraint? In this kingdom? Speaking of, he started some wars again. Didn't super work, plus the treasury was back to empty. Oh well, let's meet the last wife. Catherine Parr was a Protestant widow who served as regent while Henry was at war in France and made a point to formalize Mary and Elizabeth's places in the royal succession, thus making Catherine Parr the actual MVP of the Tudor dynasty. In any case, it was good timing because 4 years later, Henry died, leaving our last Catherine to live her best life. Oh, what a mess. A king with his priorities so twisted in knots he wasn't sure whom he wanted to marry or kill, so he did everything to everyone and called it a day. Henry's 38 years on the throne were some of England's most consequential due to his sweeping reforms of church and state, but all that sprang from the remarkable women whom he called queen. These 6 stick in our minds because of Henry's distinct notoriety, but any prominence he has in English history is owed quite thoroughly to the captivating effect they had on him.
Yeah. I mean, this is the only reason why anyone remembers Henry VIII. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. It's very reductive, but it actually works. It's like those, what do you call it when the, when like, antonyms? No. It's where the constituent letters of, first letters, letters of a word, like, conformate to, like, so you can remember the sequence of other words? I don't know. It's like never eat soggy wheat bix. North, south, east, west.
And in turn, on us. And so we've come full circle to our start.
Even though I stand that actually soggy wheat bix is actually pretty good. Especially microwaved. It basically becomes like porridge. Sprinkle some honey on that shit. It's nice. Anyway.
Starting comparison. Like monarch, like toddler, they want their mommy. Now, while we're having a laugh in the meme zone, there's one quick tangent I am morally and professionally obligated to take us on. It's my job. And my place.
Now, trying to kill one king is enough of an endeavor, but as time goes on, administrations evolve and power often gets distributed to a much wider base. This makes it infinitely more difficult to off an entire government at once. But luckily, the 1600s are a wonderful time full of such modern marvels as high explosives, and some enterprising lads wanted to make use of this new tech. So...
Oh good, he is actually going to talk about it. The attempted blowing up a Parliament House.
Let's set the scene. England has been ruled by Protestants for nearly a century, and they were making life increasingly suckish for the English Catholic holdouts. And since
Yeah.
England's Anglican monarchs kept butting heads with very Catholic Spain and getting excommunicated by the very Catholic Pope, adherence to the Church in Rome was treated on par with being an enemy of the state. This was an extremely complex mesh of religious and political factors that would require a delicate touch to overcome. Or blow up Parliament. No fuss, no persuasion checks, just an ass ton of explosives. That was the logic of these fine morons.
I just worked out. This is also referenced. I don't know how to speak. This is also referenced in Game of Thrones, where they blew up the church. The Priory? The Church of the Seven. That's the name of it. I just realized. It was also a reference. Huh. Oh, George, you boy, he loved friggin' history, didn't he?
Robert Catesby, Guy Fawkes, and 10 other Catholics conspiring to destroy the Protestant government of England under the new King James I. The scary
Everyone always remembers Guy Fawkes, though. Apparently, the English actually burn a effigy of that dude in November. The English are weird sometimes.
scariest part of the story is that the plan might have worked if the
Sometimes.
conspirators shared more than 5 brain cells between them. For instance, Step 1 was renting an apartment next to the Palace of Westminster under the bulletproof alias of John Johnson, which must have
What's a non-suspicious name? John Johnson. Uh-huh.
made the landlord think, ah yes, Mr. John Johnson, he must
That's
have a
definitely
respectable
not a
career of
fake
doing
name.
a job at Place. They then spent weeks hauling 36 full barrels of gunpowder into the apartment in advance of Parliament's reopening. But boomifying an entire government body was only part of the scheme, as they planned to start a revolt in the countryside and capture the king's Catholic daughter to install her as a puppet queen. And lastly, they'd sail over to Europe to get the Pope to support the new Catholic government and pretty please forgive us for all of the murder. So that was the idea, but Parliament was closed for most of the year because of plague, mood, and wouldn't reopen until November 5th. That left a lot of time for the conspirators to ruminate on the moral implications of terrorism. Not because murder was wrong or anything silly like that, but because they had some friends in Parliament. So despite strict orders
Yeah, and also, didn't you know that, blowing up Parliament is like an affront to God or something?
not to send any warnings to anybody, one of the conspirators sent a "hey, maybe don't go to Parliament" note to his buddy. Now this alarm bell wrapped in a red flag had the easily foreseeable consequence of getting reported straight to the Chamberlain, who proceeded to search the entirety of Parliament on the night before the plot. Imagine their surprise to find a lone gentleman standing next to a pile of firewood and 36 barrels of gunpowder in an otherwise empty apartment. A gentleman who insists that his name is John Johnson, esteemed doer of job at Place. I'm sure Guy Fawkes was shocked the constable saw through his ironclad disguise. Fawkes was subsequently tortured into giving up the names of his co-conspirators who were busy up in the countryside failing to start their revolt. Unfortunately, their excess storage of gunpowder had gotten soaked, so these big brain boys laid it out to dry in front of a fire, which is just the most apt visual metaphor for a plant blowing up in your face. The
Okay, I had no idea the conspirators were this dumb. Then again, most people who try and take over the government are pretty dumb. Just saying. In general. This is not a reference to any thing that happened recently. At all. Yes.
crew was captured and executed, and for the next century and change, British Catholics were treated even harsher because of their association with the gunpowder plot, even losing the right to vote until 1829. Nice job ending that religious persecution. Good work, team.
Ah, simply iconic. Thank you for indulging me. And now it's Shakespeare time.
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Nothing else quite sums up William Shakespeare's attitudes on the power of theater, but England's favorite bard demonstrates time and time again that the reverse is also true, that one stage can become anywhere in the world. You've surely spent a class or two with one of William's works, and heck, Red started OSP as a Shakespeare channel, but today we'll put aside
Okay, I didn't know that.
the tragedies and comedies we've handled here before, and instead focus on his relationship to history. So, to see how he became a legendary playwright and to find out why he's England's #1 accidental historian, let's do some history. William Shakespeare was born in the English town of Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564, early into the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Though Shakespeare's family wasn't noble-born or all that rich, they lived far enough from London that they could pay the rent without going on a monthly heist. Shakespeare spent some of his early life in Stratford helping in his dad's glove shop, so our young Bill would have been familiar with his local tradespeople. At the age of 18, Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway and had a daughter 6 months later, and I will let you run the math on that one. Aside from family matters, Shakespeare studied at the town's local grammar school. It wasn't fancy, but it was an honest education, and as we'll see, it gave him everything he needed to succeed in his later career as a playwright. His primary instruction was in Greek and Latin, with the aim of reading the New Testament and the ancient Roman classics in their original language.
You know what? Based. Speaking of the Roman classics, well, actually, Greek classics, I've heard good things about Epic the Musical. I need to watch that. I don't know how. I have heard it's amazingly good, though. Might try and figure out how to watch it.
On its face, this is a fairly simple curriculum, but it was radically new to Elizabethan England, as the Renaissance love for all things ancient was just making its way north. In the 1500s, a lot of things were new to England. In addition to the concept of disposable income, English theater culture was just taking shape, and it was the textbook definition of quick and dirty. With only a few permanent playhouses, most stages were simple pop-up wooden sets with no decoration and only a few key props.
Again, more things change, more things stay the same. This is basically Fringe. We have like a an arts and like theater festival called Fringe every year. Happens all around the country. It's basically this, which is kind of crazy. Just like set up a pop-up tent and have it play in that. Not that I've actually ever gone like weirdness with my acting troupe. You know, it's like the timing gets messed around and then like things happen. I hope to actually do it one year. So you know.
And unlike the ancient Greeks and Romans, England didn't have a handy catalog of material to draw from, so plays were written quickly, often in collaboration, and then performed and discarded. This meant that freelancers were in high demand, and this is probably where Shakespeare got his start in the theater biz, writing with London's other leading playwrights.
It'd be a lot cooler if this play had a skeleton.
Actors, by contrast, mostly went in troupes, working together over multiple productions over the course of years with the financial support of some hotshot patron who got the naming rights. In 1594, Shakespeare was a founding member of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, under the patronage of none other than the Lord Chamberlain. And this is where William worked as both an actor and as a playwright for the rest of his career, writing
rom-com with a body count. Rom-com, but drama.
Tragic and comic fiction, as well as historical plays for almost 2 decades. Sweet mother of job security. In 1598, the city's main playhouse was closed over a landlord dispute, so our troupe took matters into their own hands by disassembling it and hucking the timber across the Thames in the dead of winter to build a new theatre on the other side of London. Now that is dedication to the craft. The next year, the Globe became the home of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, but despite its size, it was still pretty simple. flat stage, no roof or fancy sets, standing area below, and 3 balconies above. The Globe didn't faff around. And with room for the lower class groundlings as well as the high-rolling aristocrats, everybody had a place, so Londoners of all stripes could enjoy the plays. To that end, Shakespeare wrote to the highbrow and to the low, so if your local Shakespeare production skips over the dirty jokes, then you have been duped, because that is not the authentic Shakespeareans.
Authentic Shakespeareans. Titus Andronicus, Act 4, Scene 2.
Production skips over the dirty jokes, then you
Demetrius, villain, what hast thou done? Aaron, that which thou canst not
have been
undo.
duped, because that is
Children, thou hast undone our mother. Aaron, villain, I have done thy mother.
not the authentic Shakespeareans. Before too long, Shakespeare and friends performed at the royal court for Queen Elizabeth herself, and when the crown passed to King James in 1603, he was so fond of the troupe that he became their patron and redubbed them the King's Men.
Oh, hell yeah. You're the actual patron. I didn't know that. Okay. Yeah.
Classy. And
Nice.
speaking of kings, let's zoom out for a minute to look at how England was doing in Shakespeare's day, because it was quite a busy time. Before James Stuart became king, Elizabeth was the last reigning monarch of the Tudor dynasty. The Tudors are best known for ending the War of the Roses, telling the Pope to scram, and converting the Spanish Armada into a subaquatic lumberyard. In Shakespeare's day, life was pretty good. England was peaceful, finally, and the arts had never been more popular. Ancient Greek and Roman texts were getting translated into English for popular consumption, and Raphael Holinshed had just finished up a mammoth historical chronicle of England, Scotland, and Ireland. With English
Oh.
patriotism flying higher than ever, people wanted to hear stories about English greatness. Now, most Englishmen knew how to read, sure, but Holinshed's history was about 1,000 pages too doorstoppy to be accessible to the average lad. So this is where Shakespeare comes in.
Let's make this shit accessible.
He lures you with the promise of entertainment, keeps things exciting with pathos and murder, then dazzles you with some snark and lowbrow jokes, and when you leave, you realize that he duped you into learning.
To be honest, that's kind of how the best entertainment actually works. Have a few jokes. Curse my goddamn goldfish brain. Let's have that again, I'm sorry.
Lures you with the promise of entertainment, keeps things exciting with pathos and murder, and dazzles you with some snark and lowbrow jokes, and when you leave, you realize that he duped you into learning.
Yeah. Basically. Hallmark of good entertainment. Oh shit, you learned something? What the fuck? Love it.
This might sound familiar because this is how we teach you stuff. Disregarding the fact that
Yay.
he was extremely good at writing plays, Shakespeare's mere choice of subject matter gave countless Englishmen their first glimpse at their own history. In making popular the genre of the history play, Shakespeare inadvertently became the most influential historian in England.
Oh yeah. Henry VIII. I kind of forgot that was I don't know how I forgot. It's one of the most famous that he's done, but how did I forget that he did Henry VIII? He did dramatized versions of that. Of course. God damn it.
Shakespeare's early work is loaded with histories, and his first focus was on the War of the Roses, where he covered the life of Henry VI in 3 plays
Henry VI, yeah.
and concluded with the bloody reign of Richard III. Afterwards, he jumped back in time to show the rise of the hero King Henry V. This was a 4-play sequence starting with Richard II through Henry IV and finishing with Henry V. Now, all of these plays are self-contained, but they share characters, conflicts, and some key themes. Plus,
A little bit of precursor to the MCU, I guess. World's first cinematic universe, but it's only based in history. Ah, yes.
when we put the 8 plays together into a macro story,
The Henriad. Please tell me that was made up just for this. Don't tell me that's the actual name of it. Oh, I hate that.
This Henriad becomes a century-long epic of English history's greatest hits, culminating in the ascension of
That was the actual name of it. Dude, come. That sucks. I'm sorry, Shakespeare. That naming convention fucking sucks.
Henry VII and the new Tudor dynasty. So, with our proverbial stage set,
Mate.
let's summarize some Shakespeare. Quickly and quietly before Red catches me trespassing on her turf. We begin in the late 1300s with Richard II, who's been asked to settle a dispute between two nobles over some misplaced cash and a murdered uncle. Richard dawdles and avoids doing his job, so Henry Bolingbroke takes the opportunity to coup his way into becoming King Henry IV. Now, Henry had wanted to absolve his usurpation guilt by going on a crusade, but there's turmoil at home with the nobles, so it's too risky to leave. Worse yet, his son Hal is too busy partying in the tavern to be a helpful prince, but he eventually decides to do his job and fights the rebels. Now, Hal might be a decent prince, but being a good king is a much harder ask. Unfortunately, this takes the entire runtime of the play and an earful from his dying father, but by the end he's shaped up, apologized for his misdeeds, and is ready to take on the world as King Henry V. Now, this is the spicy play. Our Prince Hal is all nice and kinged, and England is done civil warring, so he lays a renewed claim to the throne of France. In return, the French prince sends him a very rude letter and some tennis balls as a concession, so Henry, quite toasty by the slight, sets off to go a-conquering and starts the 100 Years' War back up. He first takes the port of Harfleur with a hearty once more onto the breach and pushes on to Agincourt, heavily outnumbered. The night before the battle, he treks around the camp to ruminate on how being king is effort. Ugh. And the next day, the English army surprised the French and themselves by longbow spamming their way to victory. Cut to several years later, and
I mean, to be honest, that could be like the basis for like most of like England's middle to late history. Spam with longbows. Win.
Henry is negotiating a treaty with France as well as wifing up Princess Catherine of Valois. The end. Except for the part immediately after this where Henry VI whiffs it and loses the war, but that's where the second four-parter comes in. So, time skip forward 2 years and Henry V unexpectedly bites it, so little BB Henry VI is now the king. From here, everything goes south. France starts throwing hands at Orléans with the help of one Joan of Arc, while English nobles are too busy scheming against each other to stop it. A rift opens up between the Lancaster family and the Yorks, which becomes a big mess later. Several time skips later, Joan is captured and killed by England, and Henry marries Margaret of Anjou. Despite some initial success, England lost the war and got the boot out of France, so Richard of York is rather miffed with Henry's leadership and lays a claim to the throne. This all comes to a head at the Battle of St. Albans, where York smashes the king's forces and sends Henry into disarray. With defeat in sight, Henry marks York as next in line for the throne, but Henry's wife Margaret and the Lancastrian faction think that this is stupid, so they take the fight to the Yorkies. They win for a little bit, lose for a little bit, win a little more, but then they start losing again, and eventually Henry is captured and killed in prison by Richard Jr. of York. Once again, the last play in the set is the spiciest one. Edward IV of House York is king, again, long story, and his brother Richard Jr. wants the headgear for himself, because it's civil war all the way down. So Richard jails his younger brother and drowns him in a vat of wine, which makes Edward die of shock, leaving the crown to his two kids, with
You drown him in a vat of wine. Don't know if that's real or creative license, but if that's real, super ironic. If that's creative license, I approve. You can make a joke at the, at the former guy's former hubris or whatever. My court is caught.
Richard as their regent. Clearly his work isn't done, so he convinces the nobles that the princes are illegitimate so that Richard can get the crown from his dead brother. But then to seal the deal, he had the kids killed anyway because loose ends sink royal claims.
True.
Richard takes the throne, but rebellions break out immediately afterwards, and the Earl of Richmond leads an army against the king. Before their battle, Richard is haunted by the ghosts of all the people he's killed. He gives the kingdom for a horse speech, Richmond kills him, and takes the throne as Henry VII. England's troubles are over, the Tudors have arrived.
Yay.
Now, in a stage performance, performance, there's not much room to investigate the big-scale dynamics of national conflict like you'd see in a typical history book, but Shakespeare does focus in on the nuances of kingship and how their character affects the way they rule a state. That said, these plays can get flack for retroactive Tudor bias, especially in the case of Richard III. Historically, Richard was unremarkable, but he was guilty of being the last king before the Tudors, so clearly he just has to be awful. As such, Shakespeare
You know, you gotta butter up the, you know, your, custodianship's, you know, legitimacy, otherwise he won't fund your shit. So, understandable. But yeah.
condemns him to a murder-frenzied reputation and shows rumors like the killing of the young princes as a fact. The play explicitly sets up Richard as a pure evil villain to contrast with the heroic arrival of Shakespeare's present Tudor dynasty. So while Richard III makes for great...
I'm sorry. Extravagant codpiece is apt. Also, surprise bollock knife.
With the heroic arrival of Shakespeare's present Tudor dynasty. So while Richard III makes for
look it up, it's wild.
great drama, it pulls double duty as political propaganda. And this isn't the last time that Shakespeare fiddles with facts to make a narrative more exciting, as MacBoy and wife are fully
MacBoy. Dude, I fucking love Macbeth. It's great. One of my favorite Shakespearean plays, actually.
Rewritten to be more murderous, and Cleopatra is... Alright, listen up, Bill.
Oh, God. Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, this requires a backstory. This guy's a hilarious Romaboo. He takes issue with how Shakespeare took the liberties of Ptolemaic Egypt and Rome. Understandably, but it is kind of funny.
But outside those glaring exceptions, Shakespeare tells his history pretty straight, and the benefit of a multi-person drama is that diverse perspectives can be portrayed, especially with stories like Julius Caesar, where competing rhetoric weighs the morality of tyrannicide and civil war. Shakespeare is at his best when characters and ideas are in conflict on stage, and that's just as true for his histories as it is for his dramas. Ignoring for a second how Shakespeare has made life tricky for later historians, let's appreciate the effect that he had on his contemporary audience. When history is distilled from its 1,000-page write-ups and presented in a way that people can actually appreciate, suddenly an entire share of the population can understand their national history for...
Yeah. It's told... Yeah, not everyone can, like, read wordy, you know, articulate, like, you know, actual histories. Because they're bland, they're boring, they're not entertaining, they're just massive hunks of book. William Shakespeare makes that accessible with, you know, easily understand characters and motives. I wish we could have stuff like that now. Now we get stuff like Cleopatra on Netflix. Look it up. And understand how pissed off I was when I found out about it. Just imagine me having a strange smile on my face.
Probably the first time ever. This kind of storytelling was powerful then, and it's powerful now. I mean, just think about how much better you know revolutionary American history since Hamilton came out. Though Shakespeare didn't intend to...
Okay, yeah, I have a little bit of issue with Hamilton as well. That's a whole nother thing. Anyway.
publish his plays because his script is lifeless without its actors, his friends and the King's Men compiled a folio of his works for distribution, which is why we're able to enjoy the brilliance of his plays even today. And that's actually where some get hung up on his story, because surely our talented William couldn't really have been some countryside plebeian, only a gentleman of refinement could have possibly written these masterpieces. So there have been theories that Shakespeare was just a pen name for Edward de Vere or Sir Francis Bacon or some secret guild of writers, but alas, Shakespeare was indeed a kid from Stratford who got a decent grammar school education and really enjoyed reading the classics. Perhaps the greatest Shakespeare conspiracy of all, dare I say a Shakespearacy, was that William could be
You may not say that. That is lame. Stop it.
smart without being rich.
Some interesting notions here of how history and theater interact, not just using the stage as a medium for recounting the past, but touching on these very ideas of perspective and characters. Keep that in mind as we progress along. But while we're thinking of literature, let's get a little abstract with it and pick apart the very language I am speaking to you in right now.
Here we go. Linguistics. This is where Tolkien sits up a little bit in his seat. Hell yeah.
The English language is downright weird. I don't think that's an especially controversial statement, but it's one that warrants some explanation. Sure, much fuss gets made over the nonsensical pronunciation schemes we follow. Today, I present you with this video, but if I present you, you'd worry about getting stuffed in a box with a bow on it. I mean,
Yeah. English very blatantly gets described as like 3 languages in a trench coat. It's like German, French, I just realized they're both variants of German. All of them are variants of German. It's like East German, actual German, and North German. With the Saxons.
maybe a Joker, but I am not the Joker, and you can tell the difference by my use of the. Weird indeed, huh? But ultimately,
And also the use of capital letters.
pretty surface level. No, the English wackiness goes far deeper. Despite the language's
Yeah.
ancestry in Germanic cultures from Northern Europe, half
Big G Germanic.
the words in English instead come from French and Latin. Weird. We can
Even though, as I said, French is, technically a variant of German, but
can partly explain this by pointing to the time William the Conqueror and his Norman French buddies took over England in 1066, but that's just one plot point in a much longer story. So come with me today on a tour of English, not the English, but English itself, as we piece together how our beautiful mess of a language came about. Now let's do some linguistics. First, a bit of scene setting. Languages don't appear in a vacuum, they come in families. Romance, Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic are families of languages that share similarities and origins. Sometimes they can be mutually intelligible. Say, within the Romance group, a Spanish speaker can ask a question, get an answer back in Italian, and both participants understand it. But
well, I don't really understand it. They get the gist of it. It's not a one-to-one understanding. It's more like it's a gist of what's being said.
in most cases, there's a distance and friction between a family's languages, with some farther apart than others. English is a Germanic language, meaning it's related to languages from Northern Europe and Scandinavia, but the average English speaker won't comprehend German, Frisian, Yiddish, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, Icelandic, Dutch, or Afrikaans if it's spoken to them. And
Well, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I found out some like German words because my brother was trying to learn German at one point. Some of the words are actually relatively similar. Like Krankenwagen. You know, obviously, so that's like a type of car or like type of, Kranken. Kind of, when you used to crank a siren. So it must be like a car with a siren on it. And therefore, ambulance. You could get it yeah, it's like what I said with like the romance at end of it. You can get the gist of what's being said if you concentrate. Although it might not happen with like Northern Germanic things, because maybe Yiddish, which I didn't know was a Germanic language. Interesting. Also, I'm not sure Afrikaans actually counts. I mean, it technically does, but it's technically a trade language. It's a pidgin language. I mean, it came from German speakers, but it was like an adaptation between German, Dutch, and Swahili? It was supposed to be an intermix of all three of those. So I mean, it does have Germanic roots, but I don't really necessarily count that as part of the Germanic family. Because it's like a trade language. Anyway.
As a student, an English speaker will have the hardest time trying to learn any of the others. Among that group, English is the odd one out. Why? Well, the simplest account is that English was a Germanic language, but then the French showed up. The notion
Screw you, frats!
Being that English changed after getting sat on by a Norman French monarchy for 150 years. This is true, and it fits cleanly into popular understandings of English history.
Why'd they have to draw the dicks of the horses? What the fuck?
Overall, but it's not our main culprit. As I've discovered while researching this video, linguistics is very complicated, so we won't be swimming through all the technical details of how languages work, and we're going to keep this story as clear as possible by building it in layers. Germanic plus Normans was the simplest version, now here's one layer deeper. Old English was a Germanic language brought to Britain by migrating tribes called Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, and their language picked up new vocabulary in 3 major rounds. First was Old Norse words from Scandinavian Viking raiders and settlers in the 800s and 900s. Second was French words from Monsieur Guillaume le Conquérant and the Normans in 1066. As
Guillaume.
the language of the royalty and aristocracy, French vocab was for upper-class topics, so the animal cow comes from the Old English queue, but the delicacy beef comes from the French bœuf. But English...
Yeah. It's so wild. The France is always just like, oh yeah, it's the language of aristocracy, of fanciness, and just like English is for the plebeians to... Screw you!
England and France wouldn't stay buds forever, so from the 1300s and 1400s, when the 100 Years' War was going on, English sought to distinguish itself from French by turning to Latin as a source of vocabulary. This continued into the Renaissance era as Latin words infused English, like, for instance, infuse from the Latin infundere. This also gave us a few quirky rules like not ending a sentence with a preposition or not splitting infinitives because that's how it works in Latin.
Prepositions of, to, for, and from are examples of prepositions that relate one word to another. In Latin, they can't be at the end of a sentence alone. Split infinitive. Latin verbs are one word, scindere. But in English, they can be 2 words, to split. Logic is no word should sneak in after the to.
Thus, to barbarously split an infinitive is, barbaric.
He says while splitting an infinitive. I see what you're doing.
Those were the 3 main sources of
Barbarian.
vocabulary over the centuries, but other words sprinkled in from trade with the Dutch, Spanish, and Germans. Plenty of science vocab comes from Arabic, and some extra Greek words gave English that touch of class.
God, I forgot there were like, you know, random versions of like, yeah. God, our language is a mishmash.
He said in the most non-biased way possible. That's more...
Yep, says the classicist.
More or less how English got its words, but borrowing words from visitors and neighbors is essentially how every language acquires its vocabulary. English speaks its imports proudly, but it's not an outlier for having them. This story suitably traces the history of English etymology, but it doesn't explain how English uses its words, how it spells and says them, how it puts them together with grammar. Grammar gets less attention than etymology because rules are more complicated than disparate little words, but we can put this into context all the same. Consider the evolution of modern, Middle, and Old English through the sequence of Shakespeare, Chaucer, and Beowulf. A juxtaposition so handy, it's come up on OSP before. Shakespeare's poems and plays are just an early version of our modern English. It has some word order that feels wacky to us, plus your classic these and thous and some spiffier words we may need to look up, but the rules for how words fit together and sentences get built are the same core rules we have today. Same core grammar. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are Middle English.
Yeah, this is where English kind of loses me. Chaucer Middle English is a mouthful. Also, dirty as fuck.
Macro level grammar is similar enough that we can understand the original text, but the words themselves appear.
Yeah. When that April with a shower suit, the drought of March hath pierced to the root, and bathed every vein in which liquor, of which whereto engendered is the flower. Flower. It's recognizable as English, but it's interesting.
Very odd. He comes after the Norman French influence, but well before we got our modern spellings. When that April with his showers suits is close enough to when that April with his showers sweet, but it's undeniably different. You kind of have to unfocus your eyes and feel the words rather than read them, because the rules for how we spell words.
Yeah, it's get the gist. It's essentially get the gist of what's being said. You have to kind of concentrate and like feel through it. It's interesting.
Today are different. Then there's Beowulf, which is functionally unintelligible to modern readers. This is post-Viking and pre-French, but there's a lot more different about this than just a pièce of French vocabulaire here and there. We've got letters out of Old Norse like thorn and eth and ash, and words that are entirely unrecognizable. The poem opens with lines I'm not even gonna try. It means, lo, we have heard.
Let me see if I can. What we Gardana in Gardaglum. Thor Singa Thrim Defrenun. Who the Efingus Ilen Frimnun. Fuck. God. Yep.
Heard of spear danes in days of yore, of folk kings' prowess, how the princes wrought deeds of valor, but just trying to compare them. What? Sorry, what I actually meant to say was, what?
What?
It's only a jump of a few
Exactly the same time. What?
100 years from Chaucer, and yet this is an English so distant from us that it may as well be a different language entirely. Is it even the same language? Now that's an interesting question. By lineage, yes, but practically, no it is not. So let's dig deeper to explore the third layer of English through the lens of grammar. Comparing English to its Germanic relatives, it has some weird linguistic omissions. For one, the Germanic languages all have grammatical gender and case. If those terms sound odd, it's because we don't have them in English.
Yeah, we used to have them. But, we kind of got rid of them.
By gender, we don't mean distinguishing between he or she, Mr. or Miss, but what's the...
Yeah, it determines the structure of nouns and which articles go with them. It's not literal genders, it's semantic. Gendered languages can distinguish between masculine, feminine, neuter, animate, inanimate, and others. Yeah. I'm pretty sure some Southeast Asian languages have animate and inanimate, and obviously Romance languages masculine, feminine. I don't know about neuter. Don't know about that.
gender of a cup, a table, a tank. Gender
Yep.
typically sets the ending of a word.
Germans like to have the genders of tanks. Yep, they're always masculine. Yep,
And the article that goes in front of it. So
because good.
in French, the cup is la tasse, feminine. English fully does not do that, nor does it have case, which sets the function of a noun in a sentence and the word ending changes to reflect that. In English, we do it with word order. I throw an alligator to my friend. You know the thrower, the object being thrown, and where it's going just by its position in the sentence.
Yeah. If you switch around the order, it doesn't really make sense in English.
If I say to my friend an alligator throw I,
Yeah.
the word order isn't helping us make sense
What?
of it, so it takes a second to sort out what's being thrown to whom. And if you've ever tripped up on the difference between who and whom, that's because it's a vanishingly rare example of case in the wild. We
Oh.
do mark the possessive case by putting an apostrophe s on a word's ending or throwing of in front of it, but by and large, cases elude our understanding.
The closest thing to we have the possessive or genitive case is the apostrophe s on a word's ending. If all this sounds complicated, that's because most native English speakers only discover all this when learning it from other languages.
English is the outlier among the Germanic gangs for the two big features it doesn't have, but what it does have might be even weirder. Namely, do. Do you know why we put the word do in our sentences? Before my research, I did not. It doesn't do any essential lifting, but it is nonetheless essential to not sounding like a madman. And what's with that ing ending? On paper, the present form of to listen is I listen, but if someone asks what you're doing and you say I listen to the silly history man, they'll look at you funny because the natural response is I'm listening. This continuous present tense and do verbs make English quite the oddball among the Germanics, so now let's learn why. Walk with me, viewers, as we reminisce about the cool autumn days of 450 AD. The Roman armies have left Britannia, and Germanic tribes of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes have come across the North Sea to reside in their new home. I remember it blissfully. The newcomers spoke a descendant of Proto-Germanic we can call Old English, while the pre-existing locals held on to their Celtic languages, Common Brittonic, which was a Latin-influenced form of Celtic, plus Old Welsh and Cornish in Wales and Cornwall respectively. And wouldn't you know, those Celtic languages have early equivalents of an ing present tense and those goofy little do.
Huh. I thought there was almost no remnants of the old Brythonic languages. Technically Celtic languages. In English, but the remnants are okay.
Verbs. Ah, a match. Frustratingly, we don't have good written evidence for this in English until several centuries later, but we can be confident it was there from early in the linguistic contact on the basis that writing is a fundamentally conservative medium. We know with confidence that spoken Latin was diverging from the written standard since the 400s AD, yet it's not until the 10 to 1300s that those Romance vernaculars get widely circulated in writing. Similar deal here. After the Celts were subjugated, little linguistic differences seeped into colloquial Old English over the centuries, but even by the 8 or 900s, works like Beowulf would stick firmly to a traditional literary register. No Celticisms allowed. In every language, in every era, there's a disconnect and a lag time between formal writing and common speech. So
I mean, that does make sense. There is like a lag time between, you know, how people speak and how people write. Although, actually, no, that's changed in the invention of the internet. Because, the beginnings of like internet slang were written down first, and then it migrated to people speaking them. Huh. Wow.
that's what Old English gained after its trip to Britain, but what about the features it lost? For that, we look to the Vikings, who didn't just import a bunch of words, but handily slimmed down Old English by, well, not being the best at speaking it. See, when the Danes and Norwegians came to England, they spoke Old Norse, the ancestor of
Ah, yes. Good old-fashioned, I don't know how to speak your words, funny magic man. So I will substitute it with my own. You idiot. Now let me have your stuff.
modern Scandinavian languages. Both it and Old English had case and gender at the time of the Viking Age, and overall the languages were similar enough for the Vikings and their new English wives to roughly understand each other, but not quite pick up on those finicky word endings. In a few generations of speaking and raising children in a mix of both languages, Old English and Old Norse hybridized, so plenty of words crossed over, that's the easy stuff, but grammar is harder, so gender, case, and verb conjugations got dropped. Now we do actually see a bit of document evidence for this, as Northumbria shows these changes first, and just so happened to be the heaviest area of Norse settlement. So at the end of the millennium, we have a conservative register of Old English demonstrated in Beowulf, yet the implication of a significantly different spoken English. How then did we jump to Chaucer's English 3 centuries later? I invite you to join me as we blame France. See, when the Normans came to England, there were not very many of the guys, yet French became the spoken language of the aristocracy and written language of state, replacing
Even though technically the Normans are technically hybridized Viking French-ish.
English and sending it into a century-long blackout. French left its mark on English vocabulary, but was otherwise so insular that it didn't affect English grammar. Then, in the early 1200s, geopolitics happened and England politically decoupled from France, so English asserted itself as the language of state. But here, the literary chain to Beowulfy Old English was broken, so their new starting point for written English was simply spoken English, and suddenly hundreds of years of Celtic and Scandinavian influence crashed onto the page at once. From there, the linguistic path through Chaucer, Shakespeare, and onto the modern day is quite straightforward in comparison. That is, with one planet-sized caveat. For everything we may tell ourselves, Standard English is not standard. The processes that brought English new words and reorganized its grammar are happening all over the world in over 100 dialects and languages related to English. Not just American or Australian or regional accents, but African American vernacular English, Hawaiian Pidgin, Singlish, Jamaican Patois, Naija, Hinglish, and countless others. A startlingly vast
English. Also, Australia mention! Yeah!
wealth of culture spread around the world that is an essential piece of the English lineage. English is a mess of a language, of course, but the sooner we realize it, the sooner we get to have fun with it.
Also, this is a side tangent, but anyone remember Pig Latin? I only just got reminded of its existence because I watched Monsters, Inc. recently, and there's an explicit line in Pig Latin in that movie. I wonder what the literary history is of Pig Latin. I would actually be very interested in finding out. Especially considering I'm not even sure it was written down, if at all. Because it used to be like a thing in like the late 80s to early 2000s. Pretty sure it was the late 80s. Maybe making that up. I knew it was a thing when I was a kid. And that was early 90s, so early mid-90s.
If we have to speak the damn thing, we may as well enjoy ourselves. Naturally, we've so far spent a lot of time talking about states, kings, and a legendary bard, but language is fascinating because this thing exists in the voices of actual people. The farmers, tradespeople, sailors, an endless stream of newcomers to the Isles. This is the kind of story that's difficult to tell because we have so little from them, as most of our documentation is written from the halls of power about people in those halls. But this is a great reversal because it's the true everyday voices from the small places, the otherwise quiet places that move the narrative the most. Not the easiest story to tell, but essential. So, with all that sorted, we've left England in a good spot, so we can now look wide and start tackling the other constituent kingdoms, and this is where we'll really start to see alternate and conflicting perspectives. But where to next? Alas, no director's commentary of an OSP mega compilation is complete without the proverbial ice bath that plunged from a fresh new video scarcely a year old into the absolute oldest one of the set. So, following up on this pristine look at the English language, it's only right and just that we plunge into the Scotland video, and that means we're going back to the armchair room. God help me. In researching this video, I very quickly learned a valuable lesson about how little the Scots mess around. Okay, I thought, the Scots and the English hate.
Oh my god. Wow, okay, yeah, this is old. I kind of forgot blue used to look like that. Jeez.
Each other, sure, but it can't be that bad, honestly. So I took a little peruse to see how many times the two actually fought each other, and sweet Mother Mary, that is a lot of stabbing!
Again, you're surprised. How? Mate.
Scotland! Who hurt you?
I like to complete the question. I believe it's referred to as the English. Namely for existing.
Trick question. England. So
There we go.
be warned, the Scots throughout history are every bit as bonkers as they come across on Twitter.
Called a weird French bitch out for being a weak cow on my photo, and she threatened to come to Scotland and beat me up. Oh my god, you Swiss. What? 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 Okay, I gotta read all of these. Fuck.
So be warned.
My brother showed his fourth unconditional for uni, and I've just eaten a dog biscuit thinking it was chocolate.
The Scots throughout history.
Morgul Legend News: someone in Scotland wrote wank beside every party on their ballot, other than the Green Party, beside which was written not wank. Oh, dude. Oh. According to Scottish law, that indicates clear preference, and the vote got counted. Dude, I'm not sure that will count in our parliament. Yeah, we're pretty anal about that preference thing. Well, yeah, no, you kind of have to number ours 1 to 6. Yeah.
History are every bit as bonkers as.
Oh, I missed one. Shit.
Trick question. England. So be warned, the Scots throughout history are every.
When you push a pull door and the person behind says you need a pull, I cheers. Let's sure next time we start lifting from the bottom.
Every bit as bonkers as they come across on Twitter. To find out why, let's do some history. Around 2,000 years ago, Scotland was inhabited by various tribes of Pictish Celts, living up north, herding, and minding their own business. So when the Roman Empire swaggered up to try and conquer them, they gave those Romans a walloping so bad that Emperor Hadrian built a wall just to make sure that nobody ever tried to conquer them again. So even though these original
Stay out, you lousy bullbug.
Celts weren't anything like modern Scots, it is refreshing to see the national character demonstrated so well at such an early stage.
Well, to be honest, to be fair to the Romans, they actually did try. Like, twice if we're being technical. But, Hadrian just said, you know what? Twice is enough. Let's build this wall. And actually, there's 2. There's, like, 1 here as well. But no one ever, like, counts that wall because, well, Hadrian's wall exists. They, as evidence, they tried to go into. Yeah, and they failed, so they fell back to Hadrian's wall.
Rome eventually collapsed, but Europe reintroduced itself to Scotland via Christianity and Anglo-Saxon migrations, which coalesced through the 7th century into a few main groups. For our purposes, the most relevant 2 are the Picts and the Scoti, where we get.
Yeah. I like the Picts. Even though the Scoti are technically the ancestors of, modern day Scotland, I like the Picts. Picts are my boys.
get the name Scotia, aka Scotland. In
Yeah.
843, Kenneth MacAlpin united the Scots and Picts in order to create the Kingdom of Elba. The early kingdom had to deal with the Vikings and the English in the 8 and 900s as land from every corner was getting yoinked. But beyond outside threats, there were also constant internal fisticuffs over the crown.
Yep, my father's line lived around here. Thus kind of got screwed over by the Vikings. Yay. Also, I'm gonna pause here. So I'm not gonna pause the video. I've just been talking for almost 2 hours. So I need a drink. I'm gonna get one. Talk amongst yourselves. See ya. Oh. I just remembered I got my thermos full of drinks, so I'll just refill that. Hang on. I'm back. Probably should have opened that in the hallway. Didn't realize that was going to be so fucking loud. There we go. Eesh. I don't want. I kind of want to do another playthrough of Scotland, actually. That's better. Now let's play.
The quintessential example of the early Scottish king is Macbeth, whom hereafter shall be referred to exclusively as McBoy because that play is haunted and I'm not looking for trouble. Trouble is, nearly everything you might know about him from Shakespeare is wrong. Here's why. See, the Scottish crown didn't follow a strict succession, but claimants came to debate who was best fit to rule, and this caused constant disputes that escalated into wars. So MacBoy actually killed King Duncan in a battle in the year 1040 and ruled for the next 17 years peacefully, generously, and successfully. In 1057, he died in another battle against Duncan's son Malcolm Canmore, who then assumed the throne.
Damn it, revenge.
All that stuff about murder conspiracies got added by Scottish historians centuries later, but civil wars over the throne were already a matter of protocol since the kingdom had gotten started. MacBoy's real-life path was actually quite standard. But speaking of wonky royal succession crises, the next decade brought the Norman conquest of England, and William the Conqueror's second son Henry married King Malcolm's daughter. The family relations are confusing now, and they stay that way for the next 1,000 years, so I'm gonna try to avoid specifics where I can for the sake of my sanity, but the bottom line is that the King of Scotland exchanged notes with his sister, the Queen of England, about culture and statecraft. So in the following 2 centuries, Scotland picked up some Norman tricks, like a central bureaucracy, a church hierarchy, and a curious new language derived from the Norman French, called
Side effects of the Normans may include centralized government, delegated to local lords, ecclesiastical hierarchy to standardize worship, the accursed house, spawn of French vocabulary and mangled Germanic/Gaelic grammar.
Scots. The native Gaelic was still the dominant
The Scottish dialect is their revenge against the English language for being so absurd. True!
language in the Highlands especially, but the Lowlands trended slowly towards the customs of their anglicized southern neighbors. The 11 and 1200s saw a steady back and forth between Scotland and England along the borders in Northumbria, but not a whole lot of drama. Until, however, the King of Scotland died in 1286 without a clear heir, and rather than have all 13 possible cousins duke it out the old-fashioned way, they called in the English king to mediate the dispute, which, I don't know, seems
Bit of a mistake. Just saying.
like kind of a short-sighted and terrible idea. Unsurprisingly, King Edward installed the weakest, most pliable puppet who would let him treat Scotland like a vassal state. And
Yeah, it's just be like, yes, I am definitely the most neutral person ever. Anyway, here's that bloody lackey. I mean, obviously best for the kingship. That guy. Yes. He should be efficient to control. I mean, rule over completely and independently without any other form of. Yeah, he's king.
when even that pushover got fed up with forfeiting Scottish land, paying tribute, and kneeling to English superiority, King Edward invaded Scotland, dethroned the king, and yoinked the Scottish coronation stone back to Westminster, dragging Scotland firmly under the English heel.
Yeah, the stone of scone. Stone of scone. It's fun to say. But yeah, it basically served as the in fact, you can see it in Crusader Kings 3. It's basically the Scottish, well, throne. It's basically, yeah, it's the stone upon which all, well, actually in real life it's not actually a throne. It's more like there's like the seat and the like throne, the actual throne, and the stone of stone goes under that. So yeah.
This was frankly terrible, so the Scots duly rebelled against England under the command of the famous William Wallace, who won a victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, but lost horrendously at Falkirk the next year, and was later executed by England and paraded around Scotland in pieces. Quick fun fact, of the many reasons that the movie Braveheart sucks, the blue war paint that everybody's wearing is about 1,000 years out of style for the Scots.
Yeah, true. Yeah, the only, yeah, the blue paint was really only a thing that the Picts did. And really, if they were really wanted to be like historically accurate, they would all be naked. And also have their women fight.
I mean, come on, that kind of anachronism is like dressing the cast of The Godfather in togas. It was after Wallace died that Robert the
They made him offer, I can't refuse. I need to see The Godfather, but I've been complimented on my Godfather impression. I just know it from memes. Anyway. Random side tangent.
Bruce took up the mantle of Guardian of Scotland. He had
Robert the Bruce
to kill a rival claimant to earn his title, but he also earned an
They were occupied by a foreign adversary. We cannot neglect our time-honored tradition of interregnal death matches. Hear, hear, yes!
excommunication from the Pope because apparently murdering somebody in a church is impolite.
I mean, technically speaking, I can't see the Pope's... yeah. I can see the Pope's point of view. It is genuinely frowned upon, yeah.
And a mortal sin. Pfft, whatever. He was defeated early by Edward in 1306 and went into hiding for a year before returning to win the Battle of Loudon Hill. From there, he stomped out local rivalries and united Scotland fully against the English at the decisive Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Nice. Though the treaties weren't signed for another 15 years, Robert the Bruce won Scotland 3 centuries of independence in that battle.
Yep.
For another 15 years, Robert the Bruce won.
Flag Scotland derives from the White Saltire Cross of St. Andrew, the patron of Scotland. Yep.
Scotland 3 centuries of independence in that battle. Quick OS pro tip, skip Braveheart, but watch The Outlaw King. It's better and way more accurate.
Huh. shit. I need to get a note of that. Hang on, where's my phone? Ah! Notes. Watch on. Okay, made a note of that.
So having fulfilled his dreams for his kingdom, Robert died the next year, but this was exceptionally poor timing and really unfortunate in the long run because the throne passed to a series of useless kings from the House of Stuart for the next several decades. Through the 13 and 1400s, Scotland had no real leadership, so the local lords started throwing hands, or more accurately, claymores. In this case, the warring states were actually the dozens of clans scattered across the lowlands and highlands. Mercifully, England had just gotten sucked into the 100 Years' War with France, so Scotland was free to be its own antagonist the way God intended. And although the Stuart clan still held the crown, other families like the Douglas clan were regularly challenging them for land and power. Some progress came with King James I in 1406, who sent 12,000 Scotsmen to fight with France against England in the 100 Years' War, winning big and returning home in a strong position to consolidate many of the clans under his crown and reform the kingdom. Unfortunately, he got assassinated, and it was right back to the seesawing balance of power between kings, regents, lords, and clans. Even after James, the Highlanders still largely spoke Gaelic and paid little heed to the culture or politics of the anglicized royal court in the lowlands. The king could say whatever he wants down in Edinburgh, but unless he personally marches up to Inverness to tell Clan Fraser in person to pay their taxes, it's not gonna happen. And one king even tried that, but still nothing happened. It's
You know, the Scots have like an amazing history of being stubborn when they don't even obey their own kings most of the time. Even when they personally come to your fucking house, they're just like, you know what? No, I'm not gonna do that. Because this is my house, okay? I don't care you come from the big house, this is my house.
just all very Game of Thronesy for a couple centuries.
Yeah.
And I mean, heck, it's at this time that the War of the Roses is raging on just down the street. And you know what? Since it's just a big mess anyway, I'm gonna speed round through the next 300 years, so bear with me and let's get ready for a game of Monarchy is Volatile! Let's meet our players. One king was really cool and helped reform the government to work for more of Scotland while making Edinburgh into a Renaissance capital of learning and culture. One queen got the short end of the stick when Scotland's parliament voted to convert to Protestantism while she was on vacation in France, and then she got the shorter end of the stick when England imprisoned her for 2 decades and then executed her. Her son played his cards just right and inherited the throne of England from his cousin, the childless Elizabeth, and then became king of England and Scotland. His son was so inconceivably bad at being king that his abuses of power brought England and Scotland into open rebellion for entirely separate reasons, and his reign ended with the British Isles locked in 12 years of civil war before everybody called a do-over and gave the crown back to his son. One king became king because Parliament literally invited him from the Netherlands to replace their current monarch, and then he proceeded to strangle Scottish trading rights. And the last queen on our list tried to be a pal by offering Scotland a national union with England to open up trade avenues in exchange for the bargain price of nearly all of their sovereignty. I'd originally gone way in depth about how all of this stuff went down in my first draft, but then I realized, you know what? Royal politics is dumb and confusing, and I kind of hate it more than anything else in history. So I'm gonna skip through it. Yeah. So I did. One standout event from the mid-1500s is when the King of England tried to drive a wedge between a long-standing alliance between Scotland and France in the hopes to endear
Yeah, the old alliance. One of the oldest alliances ever in history. Started like just literally about 80 or so years after William invaded and still lasts to this day. More or less. Holy crap.
Scotland to their southern English neighbours. They did this by pillaging the lowlands and burning Edinburgh to the ground. You may find that this is a bad way to make new friends. The Scots came to call the 7-year campaign the rough wooing, as
What the hell?
they did not appreciate being bullied into love. And this sentiment persisted for centuries, way up until the Act of Union in 1707. Scotland was suspicious of the Queen's offer of partnership, and while they'd get one metric British Empire out of the deal in the long run, the immediate result was England deciding they now had a constitutional right to treat Scotland like a colony.
I really fucking hate how the... It was Scotland's fucking idea. The Scots inherited your kingdom. Therefore, the Scots should be the ones who, like, call the shots. But no, you had to get your English superiority up in this bitch. And say, no, we're the center of power. You're a fucking colony. Deal with it. And I'm just like, no, fuck you. I still fucking hate that. I fucking hate that.
As you can see, this is kind of a recurring problem, and it led to 2 revolts for Scottish independence in 1715 and in 1745. Both failed, but the second one spooked England into being slightly less despicable about everything. In the next century and a half following the rebellions, things turned remarkably for the better as the Enlightenment came north. Writers like Walter Scott and Robert Burns helped rekindle the Scottish identity, and thinkers like Adam Smith and David Hume radically changed European perspectives on rational thought and economics. Hume claimed that reason was the core of human thought, and Smith described the benefits of letting people act in their own self-interest. This all sounds very profound, but don't be fooled. The clear Scottish subtext to these ideas are, the English don't make a damn lick of sense, and we'd be better off making our own decisions. And you can't expect a Scottish Enlightenment thinker to not bury snide comments at England under 2 tons of hard academic theory. Though
True.
Scotland had long been an educational powerhouse, in the following 2 centuries they also became the industrial heart of the British Empire, producing such famous doodads as the steam engine, the telephone, radar, a mechanical television, and also most of the ships in the Imperial Royal Navy.
I mean, logic will entail, you would think that they'll be the head of the empire, but apparently not. I'm sorry, I'm really salty about the Acts of Union. Turns out, like crap. But dude, the Scots should have been the ones to call the shots, okay? Repeal the Acts of Union. Hashtag repeal the Acts of Union. Make Scotland great again. Or something.
Nice. Other happy beneficiaries of the 18th and 19th centuries were the cities of Glasgow and Edinburgh, which built up substantially in the Georgian neoclassical style, and they just looked really damn pretty. Funny thing about the Edinburgh castle is instead of firing off 12 cannon shots to mark the passing of noon like the English do, they just wait 1 hour and save 11 rounds. That is so Scottish. Quickly approaching the modern day now, Scottish attitudes towards the Union grew more suspicious as England seemed to care less and less by the decade about what happened up north, and the hard-forged British identity faded with time and the decline of the British Empire. After years of campaigning, Scotland gained greater autonomy and the right to hold their own parliament in 1999. And the first words spoken there were, quote, "The Scottish Parliament, adjourned on the 25th of March, 1707, is hereby reconvened."
Oh, hell yeah. That is amazing. That was the first fucking words. That is amazing. Yes.
And if that is not some big Scotland energy right there, then wrap me in a tartan plaid and throw me in Loch Ness, because I know what is.
Okay, funny man, easy on the accent. Your Scottish audience are taking psychic damage. Now, I certainly hope we can clock the improvement between then and now. A healthy 6 years of bi-weekly uploads has to count for something, but watching this back, I'm pleased to be only slightly mortified. And as far as our exercise in perspective, this works exactly as intended. Just one alternate angle adds a ton of depth to the story. A side plot among England's civil wars and fighting the French can become nearly the whole narrative when we put the camera over Scotland's shoulder instead. So while we're doing this big experiment on perspective, let's make me a good bad example of how a framing device can get out of hand. I opened this story on the idea of this eternal rivalry, and that colored several aspects of my telling, from the top-line coverage of wars and political movements down to even my reading of Enlightenment philosophy. Not strictly incorrect, but the hand of the author is a little too visible for comfort. Now, what is missing outright is any recognition of Scotland's role in the British Empire. Sure, I mentioned that they made all the ships, but they were also the merchants and soldiers on the front lines of colonization and perpetuating the empire. That all began...
Yep, true. As evidence, well, my family. Well, actually, technically, if we're being technical about it, my father's line migrated from Canada, from Scotland to Canada, then Australia, then New Zealand. My mother's line went straight from Ireland to New Zealand. But actually Australia for like a little bit, but then straight to New Zealand. Yeah.
in the Isles themselves, with Scots colonizing Ulster in North Ireland in the 1600s on the order of Scotland's own King James. Later in the century, Scotland's attempt at an American colony in Darien ended in complete disaster, with 80% of the colonists dead and Scotland's finances utterly ruined by the venture. This
I kind of forgot Scotland tried to have colonies. That's probably the reason why people forget Scotland had colonies. Because it didn't go well.
turn contributed to Scotland's interest in the 1707 Act of Union, marrying England officially to open a joint bank account. And this is where the perspective gets fractal. From the viewpoint of the urbanized lowland Scots in Glasgow and Edinburgh, the British Empire was a party. Scots enjoyed disproportionate representation in the imperial military, with entire Scottish regiments doing the dirty work of empire in China, India, Africa, and, plot twist, Scotland again! Because up in the Highlands, when Scottish Jacobites revolted in the 1700s in hopes of putting a Scottish king back on the British throne, lowland Scots fought right alongside the English in combating those uprisings. And in the century after 1750, lowland Scots benefited mightily from the mass evictions and forcible dismantling of traditional Highland society known as the Highland clearances. Hilariously enough, I think my core mistake here was not committing enough to the idea of perspective, because my overarching narrative of the eternal England-Scotland rivalry ironically puts England in the driver's seat of Scottish history. That in turn paints Scotland as a monolith, diminishes their agency in the story, and absolves their willing hand in perpetuating the empire. The Scottish urban power centers knew exactly what they were doing in the 16 to 1900s. The deal only started to go sour when the British Empire dismantled itself after the Second World War and Scotland stopped getting the same material benefit from the arrangement. So
The traffic cone on the statue, that's funny as hell.
yes, the surface level dynamic is England conquering and oppressing Scotland, but this kind of relationship is never binary. There are strata, and some Scots were all too happy to oppress others in the Isles and around the world for the good of the empire, climbing the ladder by stepping over the Irish, the colonized, and even their fellow Scots. So, with this exercise in perspective and the benefit of way more practice over the last 5 years, the picture gets a lot fuller. Now let's keep this train rolling by hopping west to the history of Ireland.
On the surface, the history of Ireland seems like the tale of one island getting beat up for over 1,000 years straight. And, well, that's not incorrect, I'll be honest with you. But from another perspective, it's a story of a unique civilization rising from the intersection of two very different worlds, and then remarkably enduring through centuries of subjugation and hardship. When it's all too common to see entire cultures wiped from existence because of colonial oppression, Ireland is a very hard-fought counterexample. To see what makes Ireland's history so special and to learn how Irish culture survived to the present day, let's do some history. Our story begins with the migration of the Celts from Central Europe sometime in the 5th to 3rd-ish centuries BC. Okay, look, it's an ancient migration, alright? Dates are gonna be finicky on this one. And they settled on this little island here, which they named Eire after the goddess Eru, which I maybe said right? I don't know. I'm just gonna try and say as few Irish names as possible so I don't embarrass myself, which is where we get the name Ireland. And speaking of language, they spoke an early version of Irish, which is a subset of the Gaelic language family, which is a subset of the Celtic language family. Not confusing at all. Though Ireland's didn't have a written literary tradition, the culture venerated storytelling bards, as well as druids, who were priest-like figures that doubled as historians, judges, and even doctors. Another popular profession in Ireland was, surprisingly enough, king, because there was no overarching central authority, so Ireland usually had somewhere around 150 local tuatha that each had their own king. And there were no cities at this point either, so people just clustered into groups on available farmland and got to it. Though Ireland wasn't politically unified, they shared many elements of art and religion, from Celtic knots to Cuchulainn. Irish mythology is
Dude. I had no idea about like Irish mythology or anything. But one song from Miracle Sound named Cuchulainn. Give a listen to it now. It's so fucking good. Closest analogy I can possibly give you, he's basically the Irish Hulk. Because he basically relied on the doggedness of, you know, a hound, plus an insatiable fucking rage. It's really badass. You should listen to it. I'll probably watch this video as well.
And you can see some examples here, but there are also all manner of gods, heroes, and some pretty bonkers magic too. Sadly, we don't have as much information on them as we might like because the Irish mythological cycle wasn't codified until centuries later, and
yeah, by the English while they were conquering them. Too little too late, you fucks.
Parts of it have since been lost. Plus, the stories themselves sometimes conflict with one another on account of how regional these oral traditions were. Though we today only know so much about early Celtic Ireland, the picture gets clearer and the culture gets richer with Ireland's second big arrival, Christianity. Ireland actually got the good end of the deal on this one, because their conversion was peaceful and it didn't involve them getting invaded by Rome. Win-win.
Second reference. Again, comments if you get it.
And quite the opposite, in fact, as Irish pirates often found their way to the western coast of Roman Britain. In one instance, a captured young Roman lived in Ireland for 6 years before escaping back to Britain, and after some soul-searching, he trained in France to become a priest and set back out to Ireland in the hopes of converting the people to Christianity. Though he wasn't the first missionary to Ireland, this Saint Patrick, as you've probably guessed, was certainly the most consequential. The dates for his life and career are all over the place, and there's even a theory that Saint Patrick is actually an amalgamation of two different characters, but this show is history summarized and I am super not qualified to settle very much ongoing debates in the academic historical community. But what we can say for certain is that he never drove the snakes out of Ireland.
Hi, me again. Pardon the interruption, but quick addendum, he didn't kill any pagans either. That's all propaganda from centuries later out of a medieval dynasty who sought to leverage Patrick's clout for their own political ambitions over Ireland. The snakes, the pagans, and even his prominence in Irish Christianity is a wacky side effect of medieval Irish politics.
Yeah. Propaganda. You see, Christianity was good and all because the pagans were bad. Also because Christianity is good. Don't think about how the logic is cyclical, just run with it.
Bottom line, he didn't drive anything or anyone out of anywhere.
Because Celtic culture didn't just go away. It's a classic example of syncretism, where the goal is to make two disparate cultures coexist rather than have one completely supplant the other. Latin
Yep. Rome did a lot of this, by the way.
was introduced, but it was spoken right alongside Irish Gaelic. Monasteries were built all around the island, but they were regionally autonomous. Jesus was the new number one, but the old Irish mythology remained firmly in the popular conscience. Best of both worlds. And the timing of all this couldn't have been better, because while mainland Europe was splintering out into dozens of Gothic kingdoms in the wake of the Western Roman Empire's collapse, Ireland just got a jolt of new culture to play with and about 400 years of complete peace to refine it. The strongest literary tradition in Europe was made in Irish monasteries, often called scriptoria, where accounts of old Irish mythology were written alongside beautifully decorated manuscripts of the Bible. All around, Ireland was known as the Isle of Saints and Scholars, and it's because of their hard work that so much ancient Latin work survives today. Irish missionaries to Europe even laid the groundwork for Charlemagne's 9th century.
To quote from ancient literature, if it's in Greek, then we got it by the Byzantines. If it's in Latin, we got it from Ireland. Alright.
Renaissance in France. It's also during this golden age that we see and hear two core symbols of Irish culture, the Celtic cross and the harp. The cross appears in stone all over Ireland, and it's a perfect visual metaphor for how Celtic Irish culture is literally woven into Irish Christianity. Again, all this while the rest of Europe was having some serious, let's call it growing pains. Although Ireland was decentralized in both government and religion, it enjoyed over 4 centuries of peace between the numerous Tuatha and no threat of invasion. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and all shiny things must get raided by Vikings. And speaking of Vikings, Vikings! Though Ireland's didn't quite get hit as bad as the English and Scots one island over, Ireland saw its fair share of coastal looting and burning. Monasteries were an easy target because of their abundance of treasures like gemstone-covered manuscripts and their non-abundance of defensive fortifications. The Vikings did, however, contribute Ireland's first cities of Dublin, Cork, Waterford, and others settled along the island's coasts. And as the Vikings got comfortable in their cities and chilled out enough to stop with the damn raiding all the time, their cities became hubs for trade and production. Ultimately, though, Ireland's much bigger problem for the next 1,000 years would come from right across the channel. And oh golly gosh, would you look at the clock, it's time to complain about England. Woo! Sorry, professionalism. So while Ireland was having a good time minding its own business and not bothering anyone else, the Anglo-Normans came over to establish the Lordship of Ireland, which sounds a lot more, complete than it actually was. England held on to the urban population centers in the east, but because of stuff like wars and plague, it was pretty patchy for the next 5 centuries. But in 1509, Henry VIII became king and decided that he wanted to be a really big deal, so it's here that things start getting rough. See, Henry converted to Protestantism after
My order of operations here was wrong as we saw during our Henry VIII power hour, divorce came first, then the beheadings.
He got tired of killing his wives and wanted to just divorce them instead, but Ireland remained firmly Catholic. This displeased Henry, so he made a new push to colonize Ireland, and England made steady progress in beating up on the Irish, taking more and more of their land, and busting down their monasteries and churches. Unsurprisingly, the Irish rebelled. Several times. In the decade after the union of the English and Scottish crowns in 1603, King James confiscated Irish land in the northern region of Ulster to make way for Scottish colonists to start private plantations. And this marks the start of a couple unfortunate defining trends for the next 3 centuries. First is the treatment of Ireland as a subservient colony and the steady seizure of Irish land, and also the persecution of Catholicism through strict social laws.
As I said before, Ireland was the training ground for, well, colonialism. Really fucked.
17th and 18th centuries, Irish farmers became tenants in their own island, and this process only accelerated with the advent of anti-royalist and Civil War extraordinaire Oliver Cromwell, who murdered his way across Ireland during his War of the Three Kingdoms. More land was confiscated, Catholic Irish were forcibly evicted and also banned from certain jobs, and for the next 300 years, Ireland was regarded as little more than a conquered colony. Although the anti-Catholic laws were largely repealed by the turn of the 19th century, Ireland was still poorer going into the 1800s than it had arguably ever been, as its production and wealth were systematically siphoned off to Britain. Only the majority British pockets of the island in Dublin and Ulster saw much improvement, and it was these Ulster Irish who spoke for Ireland in the new United Kingdom's parliament. If this all sounds short-sighted, exploitative, and extremely fragile, you'd be correct. But wait, it only gets worse. See, Ireland's...
Yeah. He's going to talk about the potato, the potato famine, but, Wow.
agriculture was, well, dangerously precarious.
What I just say. That is an understatement as well.
Most of their food production was beef exports to Britain, and that didn't leave a whole lot of available farmland on Ireland for feeding the Irish. So the tenant farmers turned to potatoes, which had by far the most nutritional value for the space they took to grow. Not super great that the systematic exploitation of their land forced Catholic Irish to subsist entirely on a single food staple for generations, but at least they're not starving. So anyway...
Yeah, that comes later.
In 1846, the potato blight hit Ireland and all of the crops failed, so people started starving. Cool.
Yay!
The thing is, potato crops were going rotten all across America and Europe. Ireland was just the only place where potatoes were the only option. But with the crisis at hand, Parliament acted swiftly to provide rations and relief to... No, I'm just kidding. Parliamentarians in London insisted that the reports of famine were completely overblown and refused to divert resources for aid. Help did slowly arrive, but it was predicated on putting Ireland through economic reforms to modernize their infrastructure. Yeah, because that's exactly what Ireland was asking for. Not food. God, no. Laissez-faire mercantilism. Way to read the room, guys. Eventually, the blight passed and things slowly returned to normal, but not before 1 in 7 people died of starvation and 1 in 4 fled to places like America. This would be why New York and Boston...
And also Australia.
Boston have big Irish communities that materialize out of nowhere in the late 1840s. The more you know. And real quick before we move on to the 1900s, it's not a coincidence that the areas least affected by the famine were the Protestant parts. And if that was
convenience.
Wasn't bad enough, Britain was also busy shutting down the last remaining hedge schools that taught Greek and Latin to Catholic kids. Before this, Ireland's Catholicism had produced the longest continuous tradition of Greek and Latin anywhere on Earth. But God forbid kids who aren't Anglican be allowed to learn. Gross. So, what to do from here? Well, if you're the population of Ireland in the early 1900s, the answer was literally anything else, and that echoed in a call for home rule and their own independent government. However, Ulster was still fiercely unionist, and it almost looked like pro-union and pro-home rule paramilitary groups were going to start fighting about it when World War I suddenly became a much more pressing issue. But on Easter of 1916, Irish insurgents occupied government buildings in Dublin, so the British Army shelled them into surrender and then executed the rebel leaders. This, you may guess, did not sit super great with the Irish public, so as
I want to say here, I can't remember if... Was this the era of the car bombings or not? The whole IRA thing. Because I vaguely remember that being a thing when I was young. Like, vaguely. It was like when I was young.
As soon as the World War was over, Ireland fought a guerrilla war of independence, and in 1922 it was granted home rule as their own free state under the British Crown. And in the late 30s and 40s, Ireland transitioned into a fully independent republic. Ulster, however, opted to stay in the UK and became known as Northern Ireland. The split between North and South came to a head in the latter part of the century, as Northern Irish Catholics still faced heavy discrimination, and their peaceful protests met violent opposition. And this erupted into the Troubles, 3 decades of insurgency, terrorism, and police brutality in Northern Ireland.
Yeah. Time of troubles. Continue up until the 90s, I think. This is where the IRA comes in. Shouldn't really laugh. It's not really a laughing matter, but yeah.
As IRA irregulars fought against Ulster volunteer forces and British police to end British rule in Northern Ireland. After some 3,500 casualties, most of them civilian, the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 mandated that Northern Ireland could...
Oh god, it was a lot more recent than I thought. 1998! Oh god! I thought it was 95 or something. Fuck. It was Tony Blair who signed it? Fuck! God damn.
Vote to unify with the Republic at any time they liked, and that there would never again be a hard border on the island between North and South. Oh, Dear God, not again. Whew, criminy. Even when Irish history lets up, it doesn't let up. Meanwhile, the Republic of Ireland enacted a series of economic and political reforms to lift the country out of hundreds of years of poverty. And today, the people of Ireland are safer, richer, better fed, and freer to express their religion than they've been in centuries. It's distressing to see Ireland so cruelly oppressed for so long, but it's inspiring to see the past century's reclamation of Irish culture and their long-deserved independence. In Ireland, history is never far away. The legacy of their centuries-long golden age is everywhere from the Celtic cross to the Irish language, and the painful memory of the Great Famine has motivated Ireland to become a world's leader in international food aid, and I will gladly raise a pint to that.
A little bit of history about that. Apparently there's been a change of management in the Guinness plant. People don't like the new taste. Source, my very Irish brother-in-law. Well, not brother-in-law. They're not technically married, but my sister's boyfriend. Sorry. Which is a pity because Guinness was one of the only beers that I've had that I actually like the taste of. Fuck.
Yeah, compared to the cushy cities of lowland Scotland, Ireland has a significantly longer list of grievances to air. But I do want to follow this idea of perspective and ladders of oppression with a brief tangent to the Irish experience in America. As mentioned, the potato famine of the 1840s and 50s precipitated a migration.
As always, the Americans gotta make it about America. Uh-huh. Okay. Okay. Okay.
Of over 1.5 million Irish to America, hoping for a better life, or at least some food. But once there, they encountered similar kinds of anti-Catholic discrimination from the overwhelmingly Protestant population.
Yeah, you can see a little bit of that in Red Dead Redemption 2. I.e. the rival gang. I can't remember their name. No, not McGregor's. That's Scottish. It's been a while since I played a Rockstar game. God damn it.
Before the famine, the Irish presence in America was a roughly even mix of Protestant Scots-Irish from the Ulster region up north and Catholics from the other regions of Ireland. Now, on paper, all this distinction is mainly religious, but it spilled out to a whole construction of ethnicity that categorized the industrious Anglo-
Oh, yeah. This kind of shit. I forget the name of it, but who the fuck cares what the name of it is? It's shit. It is absolute shit.
Teutonic population as an entirely separate stock from the lowly, brutish Hibernians, providing a quasi-scientific justification for ethnic discrimination.
Side note, that actually, did like a whole thing in like the, early 20th century. 1900s to 1930s. With, our Aboriginal natives. Yeah, look up, The Lost Generation in Australia. It's so fucked up, man. Also, side note, the movie The Rabbit Proof Fence, also good source on that. Also, award-winning movie. It's pretty good. Subject matter, super shit, but The movie's really good. It's heavy, but it's really good.
In the 16 and 1700s, Irish migration largely landed in the countryside, but the famine brought in a very large and very Catholic population very quickly, and they clustered heavily into America's cities. This in turn triggered a fierce nativist backlash against foreigners and Catholics, with parties like the so-called Know-Nothings fighting against what they perceived as a foreign conspiracy by violently terrorizing Irish migrant communities. Bad time. The
Wow.
Irish found themselves very far down on the social ladder. They weren't suffering a famine, but they weren't meaningfully more accepted by American society than they had been by the British.
Jesus.
However, the differences here was that they weren't at the bottom of the social ladder, and they ultimately gained mainstream acceptance by pushing down against other vulnerable groups. First was against America's black population, as the Irish arrived right on the eve of the Civil War. In the South, Irish supported the Confederacy to gain favor with native Southerners, separated by religion but unified in their whiteness. Up in the Union, Irish considered the freedom of black people a direct threat to their jobs and their communities, resorting to violence just as the Know-Nothings had done against them a decade earlier. In the century following the Civil War, they further climbed the social ladder as they grew in numbers and became a fixture in society, but discrimination remained, and so did the strategy of playing on in-groups and out-groups. Irish Americans preyed on fears about growing immigration from even more foreign places like China and appealed to a shared ancestry from the Isles to win mainstream acceptance in American culture. It worked, but the cost of escaping their oppression was further perpetuating it below them. So just as we saw Scotland's complexities with the lowlands and highlands and its own role in the British Empire, likewise Ireland also has its nuances. In fact, that same century as Irish Americans were deep in the cycle of discrimination, Ireland was working to break it, as their 100 newly added members of the UK Parliament were instrumental in voting to abolish the slave trade and slavery itself while simultaneously pushing to end the harsh anti-Catholic laws. One liberation did not preclude the other. Both is good. So, juggling multiple perspectives is already tough, but as we investigate deeper, perspectives become fractal. Every history will be guilty of omitting something, but we can at least appreciate the scope of the challenge a little better. Now, we've got one more constituent kingdom to uncover, so let's hop back across the water and over to Wales. The history of the British Isles is an uneven affair, to put it mildly. We're familiar with how Scotland and Ireland drew the imperial short stick and enjoyed the pleasure of being sat upon by England, but perhaps the shortest stick of the bunch was drawn by Wales, who was often left out of the discussion entirely. And while I'm shocked that anybody could gloss over the country that is a freaking dragon flag, Wales has been tragically sidelined from the historical narrative of the Isles. And
yeah, to this day, I still don't know, like, when Wales actually integrated itself into England. Because it's not even named as a kingdom in United Kingdoms. It's just like the United Kingdoms of Scotland and Northern Ireland. It's just like, it's always left out of the conversation. Like, maybe it's left out of the actual kingdom because technically their kings, they called their kings princes, thus principality. Is that why?
I will not stand for it. Wales has impressively and improbably maintained a distinct Celtic culture since the very start, and it is far too cool for historians to be doing them dirty like that. So, to see how Wales did the hard carry for Great Britain's culture for 2,000 straight years, let's do some history. A proper understanding of this whole Wales business requires us to go way back in British history. No, too far. Yeah, there we go. See, Celtic culture in Britain is the foundation of what will eventually become Wales, but these guys aren't the easiest to get a handle on. The Celtic, or Gallic people stretched out from Central Europe towards Gaul, Iberia, and the British Isles, but also went southeast towards the Black Sea, and one problem for us loser historians is that it's unclear how, and even kinda if, they settled in Britain. There are competing theories for who, when, where, and why, ranging from the standard migration models to the possibility that very few Celts actually settled in Britain.
There's many periods in history that lack reliable documentation. The Bronze Age is an area of heavy and ongoing academic debate. Archaeology helps fill in many gaps, but there is still much about the Celts that we are merely guessing at. Such is life.
Britain. Logic being that overseas trade was key to the Bronze Age economy, and Britain's tin deposits made them a big export hub. Since tin is half
Ah yes, the tin. The wide lands of Tinland. I love Tinland. All my homies love Tinland.
The chemical structure for bronze, that meant people from all over Europe and the Mediterranean came to the Atlantic coasts to get their bronze on, and this includes our Celt boys. So it wasn't mass migration that brought Celtic people to Britain, but rather local Britons who buddied up with Celtic traders by speaking their language and copying their swirly Latin art. So according to this meme model, the local Britons thought
It's actually called the meme model. I wish I was joking.
Celtic culture was LOL so relatable XD that they adopted it all up and down the aisles. Whether or not this model is fully accurate, it would account for some weird archaeological and linguistic discrepancies in the traditional migration theory.
One notable quirk with the standard migration model is the divergence between the Brittonic and Irish branches of the Gaelic language family.
And it also foreshadows the prestige placed on bards and literary prowess by
Irish Gaelic appears to be older than Brittonic, which wouldn't make sense if Celts migrated through Britain first. Some double migration models try and reconcile this apparent contradiction.
later Celtic cultures, because it's equal parts cool as all hell and existentially horrifying that a culture can, basically by itself, take hold of an entire population by willing itself into existence. This would be our first indication that Wales has big eldritch energy.
I mean, I suppose that's probably why it's called the meme model. It is literally an entire population of people who just thought, hey, these designs look cool, and basically willed it into existence. Kinda badass. No wonder, you know, King Arthur formed in Wales. Is big, like, you know, big ball energy. Big balls energy, just like, yo, I'm the culture now.
Civilizations, however, would not follow this lead because the Romans found that culture was best delivered by spearpoint. While on their way to fill out their pan-imperial punch card and get their 10th new province free, Roman emperors in the mid-1st century campaigned into Britain. Most Roman settlements were in the south and east, where all the easy agriculture was, and although goods, coins, and Roman legions did make their way west, the cultural and linguistic impact on so-called Britannia Secunda was only slight. Perhaps the most transformative thing the Romans did in Wales was leave, because the post-Roman migrations from Central Europe into Britain totally upended the island's demographics. Frustratingly, it's nigh impossible to show this kind of thing clearly on a map, which is why turbulent centuries in history with slim documentation make blue a sad boy, but here's the gist. We know the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes from northern Europe arrived and displaced many of the Romano-Britons, but over in the west there was also an influx of Irish Celts coming in to settle. This age of migrations was much more overtly migratory than the Celtic arrival in Britain in the millennium before, though, again, the native Britons didn't really leave. After a few decades of raiding gave way to much more peaceable settlement, most Britons were happy to start speaking Germanic and make friends with their new Saxon neighbors than to up and book it for the hills.
It should really go without saying, but early medieval Britain was a fabulously diverse place, home to people from all over the Roman Empire and Northern Europe. Angles and Saxons were once a part of a larger picture, and the idea of some singular Anglo-Saxon identity is a complete fiction. That term is useless.
Still, the end result was the confinement of native Celtic culture to the far west in Wales and Cornwall, and that split explains why it's called Wales. It comes from the Germanic word wala, meaning foreigner, while the Welsh call it cymru, from the Celtic word for countryman. It's also in this migratory shuffle that the legend of the Romano-British King Arthur first pops up, though
Yep. Wales's greatest export. Other than Sea Dog VA.
it'll be a couple centuries before he's labeled as Arthur,
Look him up, he's genuinely a legend.
or a king. Honestly, the whole early medieval period in Wales has this pseudo-mythic Age of Heroes vibe to it. Good documentation is blah, what else is new, but the oral traditions that will later become the core of Welsh epic literature get their start in this era. So, as far as we can tell, what was going on in medieval Wales? Well, isolation from Germanic majority England was good for preserving a unified Celtic culture, but the politics were much more wibbly. Various local princes vied for hegemony over the many disparate realms, but succession always proved their undoing, as sons would squabble and big kingdoms would shrink back to where they started. The princes of Gwynedd and Powys were the most successful.
Gwynedd! That was the name wait, no. Shit, now I'm second guessing myself. Remember before I was mentioning a prince that actually claimed leadership from the Romans? It was either Gwynedd or Purist, or Purist, however you say that. I'm pretty sure it's Purist, now I'm thinking about it. That claimed, like, Roman lineage. Or something.
Of the bunch, and as a result, King Offa of Mercia built a dike across his border in the late 700s to try and keep Powys out. But
this guy probably won't mention it. It's a pretty recent discovery. It's like within the last couple years, I think? 5 years?
Worked about as well as any frontier walls have worked throughout history, which is to say...
The kaiju and enormous Category 4 broke through the coastal wall in less than an hour.
Barely. So despite the best attempts of Saxon kings and the Irish Sea, Wales
Random
wasn't
Pacific
entirely
Rim
cut off
reference?
from the rest of the world, as they had gotten on board with Christianity thanks to the missionary Saint David back in the 6th century. They might not have been the most consistent of pen pals with the Pope in Rome, but they were mostly on the same page. Wales' early medieval history of relative chill was aided by England's near-constant Viking tire fire, which pushed Conquer Wales way down the to-do list. But that changed when our old pals the Normans kite-shielded their way to conquering England, because suddenly this new Norman England had a much stronger army, and they proceeded to point it right at Wales. Norman lords pushed into Wales
Yeah, much stronger army, namely horses.
along the northern and southern coasts and made
Horses and also later longbowmen.
some, but not a lot of progress. Since Wales was made of small principalities, the Normans could play the Welsh off each other, but then all of their gains were only incremental. Not so easy as winning Hastings and calling it a day. While casual war was the standard for the next 200 years along the borderland marches, elements of Anglo-Norman and Welsh culture made their way across. The princes of Gwynedd, Powys, and Deheubarth picked up some Norman political structures, and England learned about Welsh longbows the hard way. Although Wales
Yeah. Wait, was it Welsh who invented the longbow? Huh.
didn't form into a unified nation, they did get close a couple times. Llewellyn Var fought off his family members to become Prince of Gwynedd and proceeded to bap all of his enemies out of the way so that he could assert his hegemony over Wales. He also tried to streamline the rules for royal succession so that every interregnum didn't immediately explode into a civil war. He then pushed eastward into the March and defeated King John of England so handily that his barons made him sign the Magna Carta to stop being such a royal knob. Llewellyn's military successes weren't quite matched by his grandson, also Llewellyn. Though he did the biggest Prince in Wales routine again, he was defeated by England's King Edward Longshanks. The next year, in 1283, Edward pushed into Wales and stomped out the princes, using the old Norman trick of building a buttload of castles in newly conquered territory to stop the locals from getting ideas. In a twist that should surprise no one, England needed more than a few of these to do the trick, so Wales has the highest castle density of any country in Europe, with over 600 built and 100 still standing today. That is, and I really cannot stress this enough, a stupid amount of castles. That's the density equivalent of 23 castles in New York City, with a less impressive but still formidable 2 castles just in Manhattan. Good lord! In any case, the post-conquest period was a weird century for Wales. Suddenly they were subordinate to England, but soon they got tied up in the 100 Years' War, and then everybody had plague to contend with. So while it was a real wacky time, it was also surprisingly indicative of the history still to come, as England goes about its business while holding a pillow over Wales.
Of all the places England conquered, Wales was the first and most thorough. So thorough that, as mentioned, it's very often overlooked. I like to describe later Welsh history as colonization on stealth mode.
face, gently shushing them and hoping nobody notices. Forgive me for speedrunning through the next several centuries, but I've already done the England plotline once, and that was painful enough. A century after a thwarted independence uprising in 1400, Wales had the good fortune to pull a reverso and put a Welshman on the English throne.
Let me know that the Welsh rose against England on other occasions too. 1287, 94, 95, 13, 14, 16, 26, 45, 69, 72, 77. 1401, 02, 05, 09, and 84. 1642, 1831, 39, and 44. 44. Ugh. Goddamn.
The man in question was one Henry VII, notable ender of the War of the Roses, and he set up Wales for greater integration with England and way more rights than they had before. This all became official via the Laws in Wales Act passed by Henry VIII in the mid-1500s. He drew up county borders, standardized laws, gave Welshmen equal status as Englishmen, and gave Wales representation in Parliament. And as an added bonus of Henry's hop over to Protestantism, the Church translated the Bible into Welsh. This protection of the Welsh language coincided with a new interest in medieval culture and ancient literature, and language became a defining feature of the Welsh identity. While all of this was going on, the political story of Wales got folded into the larger English narrative, what with the Spanish Armada-ing, the union of the crowns of England and Scotland-ing, and the creation of a globe-spanning empire-ing. Despite playing second fiddle, maybe closer to fourth,
yeah.
in the history of the British Empire, Welsh literature was rising in prominence during the Romantic movement, thanks in part to some shiny new editions of classic works. Specifically, Lady Charlotte Guest compiled and published the 4 branches of the Mabinogi, and doubly translated too, so Welsh and English readers could both enjoy the medieval folklore. In contrast to Scots Gaelic going kaput and Irish Gaelic suffering a steep decline in the 1800s that they're only recently bouncing back from,
Original Scottish Gaelic was replaced by the English adjacent Scots in the later medieval period. Scots is Germanic.
Welsh literature and poetry came in clutch for the long-term endurance of the language. But while the Romantic era was in full swing, so too was the Industrial Revolution. So all these fancy new machines and choo-choo trains needed coal if they wanted to do anything, and Wales happens to have a crap ton of the stuff. Southern Wales swiftly became the mining capital of the empire, and while coal and slate may have been big business, they were also hellish jobs to work. So Wales ended the century more urbanized than it had ever been, but the Welsh probably weren't so thrilled about why, especially as British attitudes towards them soured and Wales got the dingy reputation shared by all other regions doing heavy industry. Although the 1900s started out pretty rough,
Sorry, I kind of spaced out. There was a thing.
Shared by all
Indigo's watch suggestion, how green was my valley? An Oscar winner following the lives of Welsh coal miners in Victorian England. Interesting.
All other regions doing heavy industry. Although the 1900s started out pretty rough, what with the coal mining and a nasty spell of discrimination against the Welsh language in schools and work, Wales
In the 18 and early 1900s, students in Wales dreaded the Welsh knot, a linguistic hot potato given to anyone caught speaking Welsh. At the end of the day, whomever was unlucky enough to hold it was subject to corporal punishment. Linguistic prejudice was fierce during the Victorian High Imperial era.
Wales turned a corner after the Second World War. Industry diversified and politicians campaigned for more regional autonomy and protections for the language.
Welsh choirs are a time-honored treasure with roots in Protestant church choirs and had experience in the coal mines. They are a beloved aspect of Welsh culture.
Autonomy and protections for the language. The Welsh Language Acts of 1967 and 93 elevated Welsh to on par with English, granting bilingual signage, the right to use Welsh in legal proceedings, and Welsh language broadcasting. So now a third of Wales can speak the native language. And in 1999, Wales, and also Scotland, but that's a different story, got its own National Assembly, later promoted to Parliament. And that's Wales. Far too often sidelined in the history of the Isles,
Wales got its own parliament. Again, it's surprising. Yeah, it's always shoved down, isn't it?
Wales has an enchanting historical vibe the other three countries lack. Maybe it's the ancient Celtic language and the dragon flag getting to me, but Wales feels older, like you can wander slightly too far off a hiking trail and stumble into Narnia. As anybody who knows Welsh can confirm, it just sounds like the language dragons would speak.
Side tangent. J.R.R. Tolkien actually based his Elvish on hybridized notions of Welsh plus Nordic languages. Plus a few little other sprinklings here and there. A little bit Gaelic, a little bit Welsh. So yeah. Understandable that Welsh is one of the roots and where he got these ideas of Elvish. Which is cool.
And I know better than to disrespect the Dragon Lords.
Of all the accomplishments and legacies of the medieval world, few things capture the popular imagination like castles. These stone-built cities in miniature at once reflect the staggeringly long history of warfare as well as the splendor of royalty and the remarkable brightness of these cultures. From kings and their knights to governing officials, visiting dignitaries, traveling merchants, and agricultural locals, medieval life at every level unfolded within their towering walls, and these great citadels stand as a built record of that history. And they're the kind of multi-purpose structures where functions overlap. A wide scenic view is a strategic asset for spotting incoming armies, so most castles are smack in the middle of the most beautiful vistas imaginable. And that
Tangent. Hohenzollern Castle is one of the inspirations for the Disney castle. One of them. The other one is Ile-de-France. And wait, is it Ile-de-France or wait? It's the it's the one on that causeway that gets flooded. It's surrounded by the high wall and it's like super flat around it. I can't remember what it's called. Shit.
That aesthetic spiffiness in turn becomes a point of prestige for the castle's owner. Power, peril, and more than a little prettiness are all wrapped up in these castles.
True.
But perhaps the simplest reason why they captivate us is because we just don't make them anymore. Old cities are gorgeous, but we still have...
What was that?
Is because we just don't...
Bourgeois rich people built fake castles for their estates in the 18 and 1900s, but I mean real castles, not that 1% of BS. Note on that, actually... As a side note of that, many people in the 18 and 1900s actually built fake ruins in their states to like attract visitors. And also backyard hermits who lived on their properties to make them sound more mysterious. I'm not joking. Look those up. It's fucking wild what people did in the like Victorian era. Wait. Victorian era? Yeah.
Make them anymore. Old cities are gorgeous, but we still have cities. Churches and temples are plenty impressive, but those are everywhere. And even the grandest civic buildings have an air of normalness to them because people go to the place for their jobs. But castles are a...
Wait, what was that?
Have an air of normalness to them because people go to the place...
1, 2 job, 2 at place. 3 commit treason against His Highness King James by exploding Parliament House.
For their jobs, but castles are a relic of a time we do not live in, and that otherworldliness makes them fascinating. The reasons they were built, the shapes they took, the decorations they had, the ways they fell into ruin, all these factors are so distant to us that we see castles more as strongholds of fantasy than a living system where society and warfare converged. And I likewise struggled to wrap my head around these things until I came to Wales and saw a few for myself. Welsh castles are so numerous compared to the modest size of the place that Wales is the most castle-dense country on Earth.
Time for clown math. 600 castles for 8,000 miles squared means a castle every 13 miles thereabouts, but given the Midlands are so thoroughly mountainous, the effective density is much higher. Yeah, and understandably, mountains are like pretty conducive to putting fortresses on the top of said mountains. Yeah.
Given England is right next door, we can guess they weren't built for fun. Now, most of these castles have survived, albeit in different states of functionality or completeness, so to better understand how they worked and what they meant for the story of Wales, let's do some history. The tale of castles in Britain goes back to Roman times and their abundant need of them to deal with those rowdy Celts. At a minimum, most every town with Chester or Car gets its name from the Latin castrum and
Fun etymology. English variants of Custer, Chester, and Kester. Lancaster, Manchester. And Welsh variants of Caer and Card. Caernarfon or Cardiff. Are all derived from the Latin castrum, meaning fort or fortress. Clearly lots of forts in Roman Britannia.
was originally built as a Roman military fort. Roman Britain was a forts first, towns
Hashtag castrum life.
later kind of place. But while the Englandy bits were full of spiffy cities by the height of the empire, Roman presence in Wales was one, maybe two towns and forts for days. Much like Hadrian's Wall for Scotland, this amount of historical troublemaking is a dear source of Welsh pride. One millennium later, some of these spots got repurposed after the Norman conquest for a new age of castle building. See, in 1066, William the Conqueror won the entire kingdom after a single battle, but he needed some new strategies in order to hold on to it. What followed was the heftiest single wave of castle building in British history. With a whole kingdom to pacify and not much time to do it, William and his nobles started by locking down key cities and protecting lines of supply and communication across rivers or old Roman roads. By the end of the century, they built several hundred castles across England and South Wales. A small handful of these were made of stone, but the rest were built from wood as a motte and bailey, an earthwork hill with a central keep on top and a fortified garrison below, with stables, storehouses, and anything else the castle owner would like to have behind a wall. These first castles may not conjure all the dramatic medieval vibes, but they were quick to build and plenty effective at stopping mass uprisings against the new Norman government. Even an architecture gremlin like myself can't fault their definitely correct priorities. English castles transitioned to stone over the next century, with new and newly refurbished castles opting for a more permanent material than wood. In Wales,
True.
however, Norman rule was substantially less established, so the ease and versatility of timber castles kept them in use well into the 1200s. But even from the Normans' first arrival, the key difference from England is Wales did not come pre-conquered, so castles were built offensively rather than defensively. And in practice, that meant they were built faster, more often, much closer together, and against an organized enemy who was also building castles.
So the reason why Wales has so many castles is because they had offensive castle building. One of wood and the other of stone. That's so funny. Makes it more like a massive encountering like a board game or something.
Both the Norman lords
Like a medieval version of Monopoly. I take your 3 towns and replace it with a fort.
in the southern borderlands, called the Marches,
The Welsh marches are borderlands distinct from a core territory, either at the edge of a realm or between two realms. It comes from a Proto-Indo-European root and derives through the Latin morga.
as well as the Welsh princes themselves, were castling seemingly every river and valley in Wales. These offensive castles often skipped the motte completely and just built a fortified earthwork bailey, what we sometimes call a ringwork castle, and as the frontier shifted over the 10 to 1200s, old castles were abandoned while new ones were built to suit the current strategic needs.
A surprisingly fierce debate among architects, archaeologists, and castellologists, that's a new word, about how to differentiate castle types, so ringwork is an iffy term. What even defines a castle also gets hotly debated. Core point is sometimes speed beat thoroughness.
And that is exhausting to catalog at scale, so let's zoom into Caerphilly Castle, one of the most consequential
Ooh, wow.
and best preserved castles in the country. Originally the site of a Roman
That looks fucking pretty, man. Oh, Jesus.
fort, Caerphilly began construction all the way in 1268. Cardiff Castle, by contrast, was built just 7 miles south along the coast 2 centuries earlier. Conquering Wales, clearly a fraught process. Timetables notwithstanding, this castle was built by the noble de Clare family who added the Welsh county of Glamorgan to their already impressive portfolio of estates in 1217. In the 1260s, the young Gilbert de Clare helped win a civil war between the king and his barons and then turned his focus north to the alarming threat of the Welsh Prince Llewellyn ap Gruffydd. To protect his inland holdings and defend Cardiff itself if things got really bad, Gilbert de Clare began work on Caerphilly Castle in 1268. It was built entirely of stone, but seeing as that takes more time, it was still vulnerable enough for Prince Llewellyn to attack and possibly even destroy the castle in 1270. Construction resumed the next year in the new concentric style with nestled layers of fortifications, in this case 2 rivers and 3 outer walls. Thanks to a brief peace, the castle was finished in the mid-1270s just in time for the new English King Edward to launch a final campaign to conquer Wales. And with the prince defeated in 1282, Wales was no longer a constant war zone, so Gilbert swiftly reassessed the purpose of his castle, converting it into a fine country estate in the following decades. The fortifications on Caerphilly remain gorgeous and
Alright. New plan. Party palace. Come, my wenches. Let us enjoy our party.
their scope and complexity,
Or the Welsh equivalent.
and de Clare recognized the prestige to be had from a swanky castle, as even though the Welsh threat had passed, he continued renovating and expanding the defenses for seemingly aesthetic purposes alone. There's no strategic reason to make the outermost walls symmetrical, except matchy shapes make happy brain go burr. But
Understandably moved, yes.
by his death, Caerphilly had turned from a wartime fortress into a palace fit for a minor royal. The castle's story continues through decades of aristocratic escapades, but in the
In 1317, the castle passed through a marriage of Eleanor de Clare to Hugh de Spencer, and their son also named Hugh de Spencer. They were a real pair of nuts. Is that a phrase? I feel like it should be a phrase. But anyway, the two Hughs got in good with King Edward II when Hugh the Younger became the royal chamberlain in 1318. They did big greed, siphoning loads of wealth from the crown into Caerphilly, and causing a barren revolt, 1321 to 22, and civil war, 1326.
the 1640s, Caerphilly's peaceful quiet turns to ruin during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms when hundreds of castles across the Isles were battered by a new and very unsporting tactic called torrential cannon fire, and many of the castles that survived were deliberately wrecked after the war to render them useless. Such was the case with Caerphilly, hence the dramatic lean on the southeast tower, and so it remained until the 1920s and 30s when the Marquess of Bute launched a contentiously thorough reconstruction project, one of several in Wales around this time. Spectators in the historical community, as well as the British government, had and still have deep misgivings about the scope of the transformation and the irreversible damage to the original ruins.
Lord Bute also did read in much of Cardiff Castle seen here. The line of red bricks remarks the end of surviving stonework and the start of new construction above. It was rather thorough. Holy crap. Yeah, you can tell. Like the more uniform bricks against like the original like ringed stonework. Why'd they have to demarcate it though? Is that just due to consistency or something? I don't know.
But man, is it something else to be able to walk over a drawbridge, through a gatehouse, out to the courtyard, into the Great Hall, and up along the walls and towers. It's the rare chance to engage with a complete medieval castle. It conflicts me, yet it compels me. The history of castles in Wales continues up north, where King Edward cemented his victory by stuffing the place with more castles, just like the first Normans had done after their conquest. And the royal castles of the north are the grandest and most impressive in Wales on account of all that crown money. Here too, they shifted to luxurious residences over time as royal power solidified and warfare in Britain became the exception rather than the rule.
Tudors renovated older Welsh castles into palaces, such as Carew Castle here.
Wales got its last new castle at Raglan in the mid-1400s, and aside from a handful renovated by the Tudor monarchs, Welsh castles retreated to the background, a legacy of conquests and an older, distant era. By the time Caerphilly was ruined, nobody knew who built it or when, with explanations ranging from ancient Roman forts to a legendary pre-Christian king of Britain. Wildly off base, but when an air of fantastical mystery winds through every hall and tower, it's hard to fight that reflex. Wales is not defined by its castles, but they are the most potent physical relic of a winding, lively history. And the simple act of walking into one rockets you back to a time when that story was being written. River by river, valley by valley, castle by castle. With Wales now neatly wrapped up, that rounds out our set of 4 national histories in the Isles. The last
Yay.
big tale left to tell is the British Empire, where the
Ah,
nations don't
yes.
just intersect with each other, but starting in the 1600s, they begin to operate, willingly or unwillingly, as one
one.
cohesive unit. But before we tackle the Isles as a whole, I want to play with our perspective again, keeping our focus on each of the 4 countries, but zooming in, below the state level, down to specific centers of power in the form of their cities. If you want to scope out all of modern history from a single vantage point, you can do a heck of a lot worse than London. The capital of England got itself an involuntary fresh start in 1666 when the old medieval city burned to the dust. So with a blank canvas and a hefty allowance from the ever-expanding British Empire, London rolled out a flurry of shiny new buildings, fancy church spires, and the neoclassical colossus that is St. Paul's Cathedral. That's a
Yay.
good dome. As the empire grew and London became even more prosperous, public megaworks continued with a new seat for the British Parliament at the neo-Gothic Westminster Palace. In the 1800s, London
Why don't we just say that, you know, obviously Westminster Palace is a recent addition, relatively. Whenever he was talking about the like the bombing of British Parliament, I envisioned Westminster. I similarly forgot the Great Fire of 1666 actually happened. I am an idiot. Sheesh.
was sporting some of Europe's hottest architecture, but soon came the Industrial Revolution, which literally upended the entire city. Coal-burning factories blew smoke into the sky, railway stations the size of cathedrals transported people, goods, and
Yeah, dude. King's Cross is legit. It's so big. It's so big.
materials. The world's first subway system carved tunnels underneath the city, and the population swelled by a factor of 7 with newcomers from the Isles and across the worldwide empire. Such vast and rapid transformation gives London a fair claim to being the first modern city. And all the while, London was the driving engine of the world's biggest empire. Heck of a vantage point indeed. When Scotland signed the Act of Union with England in 1707, their
And got thoroughly screwed. I'm sorry, I have to keep mentioning it because I don't want people to fucking forget, okay? We could have had a better flag. A better Union Jack, but no. The English had to get all uppity and bullshit about it.
old capital city of Edinburgh
Sorry, this is the last time I'm gonna mention it. Probably.
was in rough shape. The hilltop castle was a scenic reminder of
Yeah, see. Wait, but... Okay, no. I'm gonna shut up about it now.
Scotland's famously combative medieval history, but the city around it was
Just saying it looks good, doesn't it?
small, dark, cramped, and unimaginably filthy. The one ace up Scotland's sleeve were the Scots themselves, who took the Protestant Reformation as an excuse to whip up one of the most free-thinking and robust education systems you'd find anywhere. This kicked up an intellectual whirlwind in the 1700s, as Scottish philosophers, economists, historians, poets, and scientists made Edinburgh the cerebral capital of Enlightenment Europe. Before too long, Scots were relieved and probably a bit impressed to see their city finally catch up with their heads. Starting in 1767, Edinburgh drained the Norloch and built a gridded, orderly, and oh so neoclassical new town on the other side. Not to be outdone, Victorian architects in the late 1800s remodeled the old town in a gorgeous neo-Gothic, so I see this as an absolute win. Edinburgh prospered off of a ballooning British Empire, but it largely sidestepped the Industrial Revolution, instead remaining the academic, architectural, and administrative heart of Scotland, a city shaped by the very ideas it represents. Not only did Wales play second fiddle to England for the millennium since its conquest by the Normans, but Wales had never been one for big urban centers. Architecturally, it was better known for the absolute ass-ton of castles the Normans built to keep Wales in line, such as Cardiff Castle, set on top of an old Roman fort from 1,000 years earlier. But in the 1800s, Cardiff suddenly became an integral link in the chain of British cities because of a little old thing called coal. During the
Yay.
Industrial Revolution,
Bonable
this
rocks.
precious rock let all the trains go choo-choo and made all of Britain's fancy new machines actually do anything.
Go
And
spin.
southern Wales happens to be loaded with the stuff. After some initial upgrades to the dockyards in the early 1800s, Cardiff became one of the busiest ports in the world by the middle of the century, with all Welsh coal flowing through their docks and rail yards to reach the rest of Britain and beyond. In the Victorian period, Brits poured into Wales in general, and Cardiff in particular, ratcheting up the city's population from 2,000 to over 80 times that by 1900, while the city took new shape, it also polished up Cardiff Castle and other original structures. At the turn of the millennium, Cardiff became the seat of the new Welsh Senate and built itself a lovely parliament building. From one castle to the capital is quite the glow-up. Dublin is the city that dragged Ireland kicking and screaming through its history. It was first founded in the 800s by Viking traders, raiders, and after the initial
Raiders.
conquests of 1169, nice, it was the main English foothold in Ireland for the next 5 centuries. Holding the dubious distinction of being England's first colony, Dublin was the biggest urban centre on the island, and it would receive quite the makeover following its hammering in the British Civil Wars. Replanned basically from scratch, the new Dublin was packed with Enlightenment ideals. Wide streets, classical designs, and splendid public buildings. Built by and for British Protestants with boatloads of empire money, the native Catholic Irish population was distinctly among the lower of Dublin's classes, and this caused some tension. In 1798, the Irish rebelled again, tried to capture Dublin.
Early Irish Uprising, 1534, 1608, 1569, 73, 1579, 83, 1593, 1603, 1608, 1641, 1642, 52, 1689, 91, and 1798.
Dublin, but succeeded only in antagonizing the British for another straight century. Don't worry, they kept on rebelling.
1799, 1803, 1803, 1804, 1848, 1867, 1881 to 85, 1882, 83, 1916, 1919 to 22, 1942 to 44, 56 to 62, and 1969 to 98. Yeah.
Culminating in the Easter Rising in 1916, Ireland's 3-year war for independence in 1919,
Land ship spotted.
and a brief civil war ending in 23, all of them fought in the streets of Dublin, which became the capital of the Irish Republic. Buildings like its post office capture the city's history, a grand Georgian edifice riddled with bullet holes from the Easter Rising.
Oh,
a beautiful
Jesus.
city, kicking and screaming. As British architects throughout history have bragged, the monument to their empire is the cities they left behind. The numerous faults of the British Empire notwithstanding, those architects had a point.
That should have been censored. It's okay, it's art. I guess.
These cities didn't just
Education, YouTube, education. It's education-ning.
find cool new ways to stack up stone, but they set the model for how modern cities interacted and meaningfully reinforced each other, both ideologically and industrially. With any of these pieces missing, Britain wouldn't have been nearly as successful as it was. But what might be most impressive is how rapidly they all redefined themselves, basically from scratch inside of only a century or two. But critically, they kept the castles. Are they practically useful? Mostly not.
No.
Are they sick as hell?
Yeah.
Yes. Credit to the Brits. They make some damn fine cities. And now, with the context established from 4 countries, their capitals, several kings, a playwright, and a very messy language, let's tie it all together for the history of the Empire. British history is famously kind of impossible. The individual sagas of the Isles up to 1600 were already plenty complex on their own, but after England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland become a geopolitical megazord, those stories interlock, and then things get really tricky.
Geopolitical megazord is definitely a phrase.
But that's just the British part, because we also
Go Power Rangers. One is definitely better than the others. It is called England. Anyway,
have the little
ostensibly the Red Power Ranger.
subject of their empire, as the following 4 centuries see a globe-trotting whirlwind of exploration and colonization that culminates in the single most cartoonishly humongous empire in human history. So in a noble but fundamentally doomed attempt to recount the interwoven stories of Britain and her empire, let's do some history. When last we left the Isles, Scotland's King James inherited the English crown in 1603 and luckily avoided being exploderized by the diabolical John Johnson and his fellow gunpowder junkies. Their plan was certainly extreme and their idiocy was correspondingly immense, but their
Bomb that
religiously
place.
motivated discontent was broadly reflective of the public's mood. The Protestant Reformation took various shapes across Europe, and this very recently, albeit loosely,
King Henry of England is legally allowed to kill his wife or whatever. I honestly do not care. I'm German. Thank you, Martin Luther. It's just like, dude, why are you writing in English?
unified Britain was running the full spectrum. Ireland was still majority Catholic, Scotland was Presbyterian Protestant, and England was a right mix. The Anglican Church was firmly Protestant but maintained Catholic-style ceremonies and administration. This sat poorly with England's Catholic and nonconformist Protestant minorities, as well as almost all Scots and Irish. A century earlier, this wouldn't have been a problem, but now that Ireland, Scotland, and England were ruled by the same king, they needed to play nice. And none of them wanted to.
No.
Add to this tension that the king and parliament were now openly antagonistic, as in 1629 King Charles dismissed parliament entirely for 11 years, and when he begrudgingly brought them back to raise taxes to finance a war against Scottish Protestants, parliament allied with the Scots against the king, defeated him in war in 1646, and executed him on charges of treason in 49. Parliament then
Okay, so he is going to talk about the Republican period, technically, that I recently found out about. It is absolutely wild that Parliament teamed up against the current king and deposed him.
abolished the monarchy, and for the next decade they governed the Isles as a republic. Catholic Ireland disliked the
Well, they called it a republic, but it's essentially the same thing as, like, you know, certain other countries that have republic in the name and not necessarily democratic at all. Suppose you can guess who I'm talking about. Yeah, it wasn't a republic at all. At all.
fiercely Protestant English government, and the Scots were understandably upset to hear that the English Parliament had murdered their Scottish king. So another round of war ensued. Scotland was straightforwardly beaten into submission, but Ireland was devastated, with between 10 and 25% of the population killed and all but Connaught fully confiscated by England. And this was not the first such conquest, as King James sent British colonists to Northern Ireland to establish the Ulster plantations in 1609. By the late 1600s, Ireland was blatantly treated as a colony. Not Protestant, not Britain, very exploitable. And we see that same logic applied to the Virginia colony in 1607 and other New World endeavors thereafter. Back in Britain, Lord Protector Cromwell died in 1658, and in his absence, the Republic started floundering. So here's a swerve for you. They asked the king to come back. In 1660, the Stuarts returned, but they wouldn't stay for long because King James II was, super Catholic. So in 1688, Parliament swerved yet again by extending an invitation to the king's Anglican daughter Mary and her very Protestant husband, Prince William of Orange, to...
Hey, yo, since we're related, can the Dutch come and, help?
throw a coup. A
Kind
coup
of.
is better than an outright civil war, but Scotland and Ireland did rebel in discontent, and England brought the hammer down hard. Meanwhile, in deposing and replacing a monarch, Parliament had all new leverage over the state, and essentially invented the concept of constitutional monarchy. The hefty political implications of that will unfold over the next few centuries, but an immediate consequence was Dutch boy William's hometown rivalry with France becoming England's business. And this geopolitical deja vu will define the long 18th century, as France and Britain compete in a second 100 Years' War, both in Europe and all across their brand new empires.
Yep. Also culminating in technically the First and Second World War. Technical World War, by the way. Because this is like both before the regarded First and Second World War. But I like to conduce like the 7 Years' War as as technically a world war, and well, the American Civil War as technically the same thing as well. Only only this is where like America would learn how to fight proxy wars because the French backed the Union side, and the English wanted to weaken their recently broke away colony, sided with the Confederates. So, yeah. I mean, I'm saying that, but yeah, ostensibly, by proxy, technically, there were 4 world wars.
Inspired by the maritime mastery of Spain and Portugal, Britain sailed across the Atlantic to snag some colonies of their own, founding Virginia in 1607 and continuing with a flurry of expeditions from the Caribbean all the way up the Atlantic coast and around Hudson's Bay. In 1664, they captured the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, renamed it
Yoink.
New York, and by the end of the century, Britain was running a solid operation. London and West British ports were bustling with imported furs, tobacco, cotton, and sugar. Seeing the opportunity to literally grow money, Britain took a page out of Portugal's colonial playbook and began buying up vast amounts of Africans to work as slaves over in the New World. And this was the infamous triangle trade. British guns and textiles pay for slaves, who then staff increasingly massive plantations, and those crops sell in Europe for boatloads of money.
So
Rinse, repeat, buy more slaves. Africans
also, probably should, illustrate this. Americans didn't actually, well, actually, not the Americans. The English didn't actually invent slavery. Weirdly enough, that people don't know this, slavery was a pretty fundamental pillar of all empires. So it's not necessarily a purely English / white / thing. Humans all did this. It's just that the English kind of made it. Well, actually, you could actually argue that they didn't even do that. I was going to say make it an industry, but the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean kind of did that anyway. So, yeah. I see you guys in America trying to, relegate people, necessarily ethnically Caucasian and white. The source of all world's problems. Newsflash. Everyone did this. So shut up about it. Thank you very much. Fuck. Sorry for the heatedness, but that shit really gets me pissed off, okay? Stop blaming my race for ostensibly shit that happened over 200 fucking years ago. Well, from 300-ish years ago to about, well, technically in the British Empire it was like 1840, 1857-ish, around there. Then the British Empire, that slavery was outlawed. Though that didn't stop exploitation, as, go back to my, thing about what we actually did to our native aborigines in the early 20th century. But that doesn't counteract my point. Stop blaming us for things that have happened since antiquity. Everyone did it. The English, and by extension a little bit of the Barbary pirates, and like around the Mediterranean, and also the Greeks and the Romans and everyone there. They just did it more efficiently. Like, fuck. Just shut the fuck up about guilting, you know, Caucasian people that we're somehow fucking evil for what our ancestors did. Anyway, rant over. Let's get back to the video.
Were treated as little more than the raw materials of empire, overworked, given nothing, and brutally abused. A fifth would die crossing the Atlantic, and the average life expectancy upon arrival was just 7 years. This was almost abhorrent enough to make people think twice before they remembered how obscenely rich it was making them. Slaves made money, money made armies, armies made empire. Rinse, repeat, buy more slaves. In Britain, this cycle paid for improvements in government bureaucracy and overhauled all of finance with innovations like the central bank. And during the 1700s, these early successes just kept on compounding. 1702, France tries out for the Spanish crown and Britain makes them pay for it with Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. Plus, they take Gibraltar from Spain, so now Britain decides who gets in and out of the Mediterranean.
I always wondered how that happened. Gibraltar getting, like, okay. Sure.
1740, Britain dunks on the French Navy because they can. 1754, British and French colonists fight over who gets North America, and 2 years later, all of Europe is throwing hands at each other.
See what I mean? 7 Years' War. First World War. Look. It's across an ocean. How can it not be a First World War?
Britain's massive pocketbooks let them throw infinity money at the problem, so they take French Quebec and the Mississippi River Valley.
It's just good business.
Push France out of India, and with this field to themselves.
France was in India? Okay.
Themselves begin steamrolling all of India. The 7 Years' War doubled the size of the British Empire and knocked out every outside threat, so now they just needed to keep it together. And naturally they didn't. See, when the British imposed new taxes on stamps and tea to pay for the ludicrously expensive war they just fought, American colonists were furious to be treated like, gasp, a colony. So they started asking.
It is fucking petty, though. I mean, you have to admit it. This is fucking petty as balls. By all accounts, it was not even like a decent tax. It was a 2 or 3% tax on fucking tea. You guys were angry about a tax on tea. You guys don't even fucking drink this stuff anymore. Well, I mean, except Arizona iced tea. I'm not even sure that can be classified as tea. But my point still stands. It's ridiculous. You dare tax us? Fuck you, rises up.
Asking the philosophical questions at the heart of self-determination, such as, hey, King George, what's the opposite of tea? Yeet! Worse yet, France was egging
Okay, that doesn't even remotely make sense.
them on, and then they got ideas.
Yeah.
Of course, the French Revolution is a philosophical and political doozy all on its own, but what matters for us is that France threw down the gauntlet with basically everyone and conquered nearly all of mainland Europe.
And this is one of the many reasons why I kind of do not like the whole, oh yeah, France is stupid at war. They surrendered and only like immediately to the Germans. Dude. Like 150 years before they conquered nearly all of fucking Europe. Are you kidding me? And actually, look up France's military victories. They're the top of everyone in the world. So I will hear no French slander, okay? Unless it's to do, you know, with how they basically ruined the English language, but that's a whole... They did do that.
Britain withstood a continental trade embargo and even blocked an attempted invasion, but their greatest weapon was Napoleon's own hubris, as his
Okay, canonically, Napoleon, not short. He was 5'8". That's not fucking short. I mean, says a 6-foot tall man, but 5'8" isn't short, especially when you consider the actual, you know, demographics of how tall men were back then. So, yeah.
His empire evaporated in 1815, and the Second Hundred Years' War was firmly in the books.
Yep. France won.
Point: Britain. Well,
Yeah.
the empire was gearing up to become the master of the world. Britain still needed to be the master of itself, and that was a tricky prospect. After the Revolution of 1688, Catholic and pro-Stuart uprisings in Ireland and later in Scotland threatened to untie the delicate knot that kept the kingdoms together. So England solved the issue by two means: legal mechanisms and violence. In 1707, England formally unified with Scotland to create the Kingdom of Great Britain, and again in 18...
Scotland unified with Britain, with England, to form Britain. It wasn't the last time, I lied. This will continue to be a sore spot for me. Deal with it.
to create the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. What was once a complex web of personal unions and technically independent states were now just the same kingdom.
Technically independent states. That's a hell of a loaded word.
Nice and easy. This was enforced
Very easy, yes.
forcefully, as a slew of penal laws in Ireland systematically deprived Catholics of property, religious freedom, and political rights. These laws were repealed in the late 1700s and early 1800s, but as we see with the unchecked devastation of the potato famine in the middle of the century, the government still didn't really care all that much. As is the case from earlier, Scotland got off quite a bit easier. Well, the agriculture of the Highlands was entirely overhauled, with mass evictions, the complete disassembling of the clan system, and a little touch of cultural erasure. The cities in the south had a grand old time, as Edinburgh was the brains of the empire and Glasgow's ships were the heart of Britain's maritime power. And speaking of power, the turn of the century brought the Industrial Revolution, which gave Britain the tools and the technologies to single-handedly dunk on the entire rest of the planet. The advent of mechanized industry and steam power changed the lives of everyday Britons by bringing them affordable consumer goods while cramming them into cities and, in the case of the poor, factories. But that in turn made Britain the manufacturer to the world and, increasingly, its owner. With cool new gizmos like steamships, Britain could hold a network of colonies no matter how far they were. To reach the vast riches of India, British sailors could pass along Sierra Leone, St. Helena, the Cape Colony, Mauritius, and the Maldives. But by the end of the century, after the Suez Canal opened, you could pass Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, Egypt, Aden, and Somaliland, and then keep going past India to Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand without once making port on a coast that didn't belong to Queen Victoria. In 1920...
Okay, this is a bit of, well, not really a side tangent, but it's only recently, since about the 1930s, that the sun is actually set in the British Empire. I can't remember who actually declared their independence, but it's somewhere in the Pacific, understandably. That means, like, as of a couple years ago, maybe 2 years ago, the sun has indeed finally set on the British Empire. Took almost 100 years.
One, you could walk from South Africa to Mesopotamia and never leave British territory. The raw scope and diversity of locales at play here is frankly absurd, as it's dizzying to distinguish what's behind this blanket of red draped over a quarter of the world. And while that diversity found its way into Britain itself through communities and art and food from all over, it raised
I'm sorry, but
found its way into Britain itself through community.
I love how it's like random Freddie Mercury, but I mean, it is technically true, though. It's like random painting Freddie Mercury and chicken curry.
Food from all
Chicken masala. Yay. I mean, it is bloody good, though.
over, it raises some rather thorny questions about belonging and ownership. There was a tangible dissonance between the idea
Dude,
of
stop
all these
showing
disparate
this
cultures
map.
coming
It's got
together and
titties
the
on it.
reality of Britain sitting at the
Fuck.
top. Still, British and other European empires knew that outright colonization was not
YouTube, it's education. Please believe me.
necessary to squeeze out wealth, and the prime example is China, which
Oh, yes. Good old China. Good, we're getting to do that.
Britain ransacked in the Opium Wars to get better trading rights and a tiny little island.
Okay, fun fact. I find this extremely hilarious, but it definitely isn't at the time. The UK wanted to get the Chinese hooked on opium. Response? China tried to pull an America and threw the opium in the ocean. I mean, they eventually came back and did it much harder, and it worked, but they tried to do it in America, but it failed. I find that kind of funny.
Called Hong Kong, because why bother colonizing all of China when you can just smack them into letting you trade whatever and wherever you want? Of course, keeping these far-flung territories safe from other prying empires produced a cycle of take it now so no one else can, leading the Europeans to carve up all of Africa in just 20 years. As we know, it wasn't long before they pointed those carving knives at
Yeah, good old drawing lines in a map and just pointing at it and saying that's mine.
each other, and so
Love that.
the world wars happen. Yes, they're very important, we're not getting into it. What matters to Britain is that although it did win both wars, it lost heavily in that process. Despite scoring some prizes from the losing empires along the way, it became clear that these colonies, which fought so hard for the British cause and were sometimes in the theaters of war themselves, needed the big reward.
I mean, we technically did get some rewards. Namely, yeah, these islands mainly, and also New Guinea, which I didn't realize was a part of Australia until a couple years, maybe not even a couple years ago, a year ago. I only just remember because, well, I remember looking at like one of my old atlases and saying, why did Australia have New Guinea? And yeah, that's yeah. We like granted it independence in the 60s, I believe. Yeah, and most of these islands, well, like we still have, but I still hold this above the England, in that they thoroughly screwed over our actual contribution in the war, specifically right here in Gallipoli. The commanders thoroughly botched the landing. We were supposed to land like somewhere around here. When we landed like about here, where the fortifications were very much not prepared for, and thus we got bogged down on the beach for like 6 or 7 months. I mean, at least we got rewarded for it, kind of, with those islands that I mentioned, but they weren't really that good because, you know, as mentioned, we let these go about 30 years later, so it, or 30 or 40 years later. Like, and in World War II, we got even less recognition for it. That's a whole nother story.
Much of the British public was for this, as the wheels of national sovereignty had been turning since Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa became self-governing dominions around the turn of the century, and the Republic of Ireland gained independence in 1922. But after the Second World War, those ideas were finally trickling out to the other colonies. So over the next few decades, the empire dismantled itself, mostly non-militarily, but very...
What was that?
few decades, the empire dismantled itself, mostly...
Point of exception being the Mau Mau uprising of 1952 to 60. Huh.
non-militarily, but very irresponsibly. As a rule, Britain didn't care where they drew the borders, nor how bad of a mess they left behind.
Yeah, that's basically a mood for any European power. Just draw the line. Who the fuck cares who I displace in the process? It's like a toddler with a fucking crayon.
Exhibit A, India.
Yep.
This continued through the 1900s and
Yeah, with the weirdly two Pakistans.
culminated, somewhat tragically, with the handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997. Built from the ground up in the span of a century and a half, Hong Kong had an international identity and a true blend of cultures that, despite centuries of lofty ambitions, no other colony had ever achieved. Far
It's weird calling Hong Kong a colony. And also, I vaguely remember this. Vaguely, I was 7 years old, but still, I remember-ish.
be it from me, of all people, to bemoan the death of the British Empire, but I will mourn Hong Kong. Meanwhile, in the closing hours of the century, the United Kingdom allowed Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland to form their own parliaments and govern themselves more directly. What that means for the future of Britain? We're not there yet. And that, whew, is the history of the British Empire. What it all meant and what we should take away from it are the subjects of vigorous academic and public debate. I can go on and on from my comfy top-down perspective, but the consequence...
To speak so top-down, risks making the story as told and analytical as a board game. One which astoundingly actually exists. Yeah. It's like one of the precursors of, Risk, really enough.
consequences of this history play out in the lives of billions of people.
Game of British Empire or trading with colonies. Each player starts with cargo from London and has to deliver same and take up from colonies what they export. Dude, this is the most... Wow.
In the Isles and around the world. Its constitutional government, industrialization, global networks, bitter post-colonial rivalries, treasures missing from their home cultures, and
Oh, yeah. Yes, the treasures liberated from other cultures. Leading to the rather intriguing idea that Italy has more fucking obelisks in it than fucking Egypt does. I love appropriation, it's fun.
a very, very contested picture of British identity. Who belongs? Who benefits? Even just inside of Britain, that is a lot to unpack. And with the topic as broad as the British Empire, there are no universal answers. What can I say? That's Empire for you. And so our winding multi-lane story finally arrives at the modern day, just in time for history to not let up in the slightest. But as we lift our eyes up from the kaleidoscope of England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Britain, the Isles, the Empire, and the world, what have we learned? On paper, a lot. A lot of kings, a lot of dates, and a lot of stabbing. As a system, the Isles are so dang intricate, demonstrating just how much causes in one corner can have effects on the far opposite end. And when we look at the handful of really big arcs that play out over the last 2,000 years, it's impossible to find a pocket that isn't affected in some unique way. For the sake of perspective on just how much we've covered, let's quickly run it back. First there was the arrival and departure of Rome, then the advent of Christianity, the Germanic migrations and the Viking menace in the early medieval period, and the transformation of Britain by the hands of the Normans. Every society across Britain and Ireland played out those plot beats, but each experienced them very differently. Then the next 1,000 years saw the Isles as the incubation chamber for what would become the modern world, in no small part because of what was going on here up north. With the slow development of parliamentary government, the Reformation giving rise to a new kind of church and a new kind of state, plus the dodgy dynamics those religious differences created downstream. And of course, the shaping, for better and worse, of a truly global society. First tentatively in the 16 and 1700s, then very intensely in the 1800s before unraveling in the century after. The British Empire fell, as all do, but not without transforming the very face of the world through industrialization. Again, for better and worse. The raw history alone is essential to understanding the world of the past and the world of today, but the story becomes far more fascinating when we deviate from that overriding English perspective, looking laterally to appreciate Scotland, Ireland, and Wales as full characters in the drama, zooming in to see the scale of regions, cities, and remarkable individuals, then getting weird with it by investigating from the viewpoint of literature, architecture, and language. With something so complex, our temptation is to streamline it and simplify it down, but the history of the Isles cannot be one narrative. It's not a monologue, it's a play. The big twist is that the best writer in British history offers us the best lens to understand British history. Shakespeare's medium of choice encourages us to consider how stories are made through the interaction of characters, their motivations, collaborations, and conflicts. This history challenges me, and at times I've let it get the better of me, but I've come to appreciate it so much more through this exercise in perspectives. Shakespeare said, "All the world's a stage," and as in his globe, so too in our globe. The audience is an essential part of the show. Thank you so much for watching. This is a winding, overlapping narrative that unfolds in truly fascinating ways, but I think we can all agree that none of this works without the binding glue, the keystone story that is John Johnson doing job at place. Without that, nothing matters. Now, if you'll excuse me, I gotta pass the hell out, so I'll see you in the next video.
And that is the complete history of the British Isles. Highly recommended. Subscribe to Overly Sarcastic Productions. They don't only do history, they do, well, myths and legends. They do, pop culture sometimes. That's mainly, due to the counterpart, briefly mentioned of Blue. She likes the pop culture, and yeah, highly recommended. As always, I will link it in the description, and holy goddamn, this is almost 4 hours of me talking. Oh god, I hope you enjoy. I was hoping I'll do like a little bit more recording today, but I started at about 8 and now it's almost 11:30. So I mean, I guess I could. I mean, I don't have work. You know what? Let's be stupid. I'm gonna record Ghost of Tsushima right after this. If you want to, if you're interested in that, please like and subscribe. Please share this video as well if you like this kind of content of me yapping over videos. I also play games. I'm currently playing Ghost of Tsushima, Cyberpunk 2077 for the 4th time, and also Civilization 5. Only enough being the Romans. So if you like this, stick around. Would love having you here. Anyway, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, whatever's left of it. And this is Purist signing off.